welcome to All Rise. It's me, Derek Caldwell, once again with Abdu Murray. And we are back. 2 weeks ago, we posted a podcast of your debate with new atheist, before it was cool to be a new atheist.
He was an old new atheist.
He was an old new atheist.
Yep.
Dan Barker, former preacher.
One of the many contradictions of Dan Barker's life.
Yes.
Is old new atheist, and his worldview is inherently contradictory. We're going to find out in a second, but anyway.
Yeah. So I hope everyone, this episode will make a lot more sense if you go back and listen to that episode if you haven't already. So we're going to be answering some of the actual things he said. We're going to be talking about the debate, tactics, things like that. So this will be kind of instructional, but also answering some of the things that you didn't have time to answer then, because the purpose of the debate was not a lot of the things that Dan was bringing up.
He went off script quite a few times.
Yeah.
Despite being told by the moderator to not go off script, he did quite a bit. Now, this is the funny part, is that we actually debated on purpose, which meant we did it intentionally. But the debate was actually about purpose.
Yeah.
And the hilarious part is that, which we're going to find out later, is Dan's a determinist, so he doesn't actually believe that we have volition and free will. Mm-hmm. So we actually didn't debate the purpose debate on purpose. We just reacted to things as people who react to things will if they're a determinist. We just reacted to causality. Yeah. So that's how it goes. Yeah. Anyway.
Yeah. So we've first a note on, because I think we can just be we don't need to be like brutal, but we can be critical, and we can talk about the things that we noticed. And so it was pretty clear to me that going into this debate, and as you watched it, Dan does a lot of debates, and you think, like, how do people do so many debates? Like, how do they take the time to prepare for the specific person they're debating and their arguments and whatever? And it appeared that Dan just didn't actually do that, and maybe he never does that. Maybe he's just he has created his data, and he's created his talking points, and just assumes they'll be kind of foolproof they'll be bulletproof against anyone. But one of the things that's important, it is important to understand who you're talking to and to respond to actual things. Don't create straw men. Don't assume something. And so just to give people a little bit of a glimpse, this is the stack of just the books, not even the online debates, right, that you and I went through to debate Dan. I don't need all of these up here. This was just to show people
the size.
And there's a lot there. These two books are kind of the same book.
They're most, well, I shouldn't say it. They're kind of all the same book, but anyway.
Yeah. So and he kind of there's like in Godless, he kind of talks about a lot of stuff that he expands upon in smaller books later, and so he makes different points. Now, the one we will be focusing on in a little bit is God, the most unpleasant character in all of fiction, which is a line he takes from Richard Dawkins. He actually wrote this book at the request of Richard Dawkins, who wanted some Bible verses to back up a famous quote he has about God being misogynistic,
malevolent, pestilential, bully,
blah blah blah. And Dan said Richard was too nice to the theists and the Christians, so he added some in here. And these are all the verses. And there's a reason we'll bring that up later. But so what else would you like to sort of and maybe we can play the first clip and talk about it, because the first clip kind of looks at we get into the opening and something he says, something you anticipated because you prepared. Right.
Well, and that's kind of one of the things that's interesting about the stack of books you held up, is that one of those books is the book that formed the basis of this debate. So Sam Miele, who is a Canadian who hosts a show on the News Forum in Canada called My Generation, he heard, I think, the audio version, or maybe even read the actual print version of the book, Life Driven Purpose, which is Dan's book, which is a derivative of course, Rick Warren's The Purpose-Driven Life. And he basically... It's a contradiction, which is another title to one of his books, too, about the inverse thing where something seems contradictory, but it's based on your perspective and all that kind of stuff. So Dan basically makes the argument that there is no purpose of life. There's no outside purpose to life. There's only a purpose in life. It's completely subjective. It's something that you and I give to it using our free will. So having when you're going to debate a guy, especially about so let me back up. Sam Miele read the book, wanted Dan to expound upon it, and thought, hey, why don't we do a debate to expound upon this? So not only can Dan have a chance to expound upon his ideas, but his ideas can be challenged. So we had a dialogue, and this is what the impetus for this dialogue was. And so because if you want to responsibly prepare for a debate, you should probably read the book that the debate's about. And that's what I did. I read the book and I asked you to read a couple other books because time doesn't allow you to read every single thing a person writes. But here's my philosophy, generally speaking, on debate preparation. Hopefully this is helpful, is the reason why certain people can do debates all the time is because either A, they've heard this person's arguments and they're very familiar with that person's arguments, and so they've essentially prepared over the time just listening to that person. So they're prepared. Other folks don't prepare at all. They just walk in thinking, my arguments are awesome no matter what arguments he says. I've heard it and seen it done it before. Dan's done like 100 and something debates before I even debated him. And so he makes the assumption that he can respond because he's prepared by virtue of his experience. I, no matter how much experience I might have, and as a trial lawyer, this was the case, and I was told this by my mentors, and it's true. A trial lawyer, a good trial lawyer, knows his opponent's case better than his opponent knows his own case. So that means I had to read everything the guy wrote as much as I possibly could and watch as many videos as I possibly could to see not only his arguments but his debate style.
Yeah, time is not unlimited, but you do what you can.
Right, exactly. You do what you can because we actually do a lot of other speaking, a lot of other writing as well. So it took up some time. So that leads into this first clip. Because this is the first clip we're going to play is part of Dan's opening statement. Now remember, the debate is about purpose. Where do we find purpose? Can we find purpose at all? And so Dan talks about the idea here. He's going to unfold it about how if purpose comes from above, from outside of us, we have extrinsic purpose, then all we become is a tool in the hand of the carpenter. We're just a hammer. So this is what he has to say.
What's the hammer for? What is its purpose in life? Well, the hammer doesn't have any purpose, does it? If you didn't know what a hammer was, you could pick it up and go, what is this? Oh, maybe it's a weapon, or maybe it's a juggling toy, or it's supposed to have a force to it. It can be used for a lot of different things. I actually once saw a driver of a trash truck stop outside our building, and the driver got out of the truck and took a hammer and laid it down in the street in front of the truck. And I'm going, what's he doing? He rolled out the trash bins, and he used that hammer as a chuck to stop the wheels from rolling down the hill. So that hammer itself doesn't have any purpose. It depends on the person who's using it. Living organisms, on the other hand, like the chipmunks in my backyard, and I write about one of my chipmunk friends in my book, Free Will Explained. When you see the chipmunk moving around, you think, what is it doing? Why? What's its purpose? Maybe it's looking for food, maybe it's trying to find a mate, maybe it's trying to avoid a predator. But you realize that the purpose of that little living organism resides within the organism. It's not something outside of it, using it as if it is a tool.
So I was hoping you'd say that, because having read Purpose-Driven or Life-Driven Purpose and all this, I knew at some point where I anticipated he'd talk about the fact that if purpose comes from outside of us, that we are essentially a hammer. We're basically just a tool in the hand of something else. And that leads up to his entire argument that the idea that purpose comes from outside of us is a bad thing. Rather, what you really should embrace is purpose from within. I was hoping he would say it. And you get nervous sometimes because people change their minds. People write different things. Well, he was pretty consistent. He hasn't changed his mind. There's been no sense in which he's updated any of his arguments and that kind of thing. So I was waiting for him to say it. And that's part of the whole, and it's going to come into effect later. We're going to play a clip later where I wrote a note down. He said the hammer thing, so I get to nail him with it later. Haha, pun intended. So that's just, the whole point of this is just to show that this kind of thing, when you prepare, people say the things you expect them to say because you prepared for it. As an aside, by the way, when I walked and I met Dan, by the way, incredibly pleasant guy when we met. I had my notes and I had my stuff on my laptop and all that. He had literally a folder with 4 blank sheets of paper. That's it. I don't know what was going to happen after that, but he must have thought, there's nothing here that I need to prepare for, which was in some ways sort of insulting. But in another way, it's like, okay, good. Oh, I prepared. I'm ready to go.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, and yeah, I just I don't know. Just that's like something that I would just be horrible. That's like a nightmare that you have where you have a debate and you go in and you've got 4 sheets of blank paper. That's like, I think my wife and a lot of other women have nightmares where their teeth are falling out. That's like my teeth falling out nightmare.
Yeah.
So next clip.
Yeah.
Similar thing. Something he said in his opening.
Right.
That you were prepared for.
Right. Exactly. So here it is.
Problem solving. We meet challenges in life, and we have goals, we have ends, we have tasks we want to accomplish, and the effort of accomplishing that task, or at least trying to, is what gives us purpose. Purpose is goal-oriented. It has some kind of an end to it.
Now, that's an interesting thing, because I was hoping he'd say that too, because he said that in his book, and I was waiting for him to say this again here in this particular debate. So I think he prepared by just reading his own stuff. And then went ahead and said this. And the reason I wanted him to say this is because in my opening statement, I wanted to make sure that I bookended my arguments where I state Dan's case, because I say this later on. To refute Dan's case, all you need to do is restate it. That's all you need to do is restate his case, because he actually makes the case for me that his view is completely contradictory just by stating it. And so all I need to show is that Dan's case is inherently contradictory. And this is one of those areas where I was hoping he'd say something, because in my opening statement, we're talking about purpose. Does life have purpose? Can it be extrinsic? Can it be intrinsic? And these kind of things. Well, the problem is that if Dan believes that we have purpose, then he believes inherently in the idea of free will, so that we can do things on purpose. He just said it in the clip, that things are goal-oriented. Well, if you just react to external stimuli as a determinist, then there's no real goal to be oriented toward. Well, he says that purpose is problem solving. And I remember when I first read that, I thought, has he been challenged on this in any way, shape, or form? Has someone stopped and said, hey, Dan, when you say purpose is problem solving, what about those who can't solve problems? What about the infirm? What about infants? What about people in comas? What about someone whose cognitive faculties are deteriorating because of Alzheimer's? They can't solve problems on a strictly materialist view. They've become the problem, so they don't have a problem they don't have a problem to solve in that way. Which is why I brought into my opening statement, anticipating what he was going to say, because I prepared. I brought in the example of a friend of mine who has passed away recently, who I had the honor of doing a funeral for, who was all about solving people's problems. He loved helping people. He was just constantly helping people in any way he could. And Alzheimer's started to grip his life, and he started forgetting things. He started helping when there wasn't a need. He was solving a problem that no one actually had, and started getting in the way as opposed to actually helping people. And it started to frustrate him, because he began to see his sort of purpose in life waning. So the question I was going to ask was, and I set it up for in the opening, is, what about my friend? If there is no extrinsic purpose, and you only have purpose because of problem solving, and you orient yourself towards a problem that you solve, what about those of us who can't do that? Does their life no longer have meaning? Does it no longer have purpose? They can't even create a purpose themselves. If there's no such thing as purpose of life, only purpose in life, this person has no purpose. So I set that up in my opening because I wanted to bring it back in the closing as well, and then sprinkle it throughout the entire debate. I think that's how good debate is done, is that you set up a premise, usually using a weakness, not only a strength of your case, but a weakness of your opponent's case, and then bring that weakness back up every so often in the debate, so that you can bring it back up at the closing and really end the thing on the same note you started it on.
In your closing, I think, and I don't remember from this if we play it or not, but your closing, if people go back and listen to it, it's basically that you restate his case using essentially what you've been peppering in the whole way, purpose, but it requires free will, but you don't have free will, so it's this fiction. He wants you to believe in this fiction, this faith, this fairy tale.
Yeah.
And yeah, I think you did that really well just to do that and use his own words, and that's
Yeah, and what you're going to see throughout some of the clips that we play here, and if you watch the entire debate, is that in large respect, not in every respect, but in large respect, Dan never actually acknowledges the contradictions of his own worldview. That purpose, if it's completely internal, actually breaks down based on his own worldview. Instead, he resorts to, well, God's terrible. The Old Testament God is terrible. And it's kind of the thing that Dan's really known for and sort of famous for, is for saying God of the Old Testament, even the God of the New Testament, isn't worth believing in. And he keeps on going back there and doesn't actually address the argument that I'm trying to make, which is, help me. If we are just machines who respond to external stimuli, then how do we even create our own sense of purpose? Because all we do is respond to things. We don't have free will. So,
well, and I want to point out to viewers and listeners that there is a coldness in this view also, that sometimes they will try to present these things as beautiful, and this is actually better. But you have issues like this where if you have Alzheimer's, then I don't think he would have any recourse to answer. I mean, he would have no way of answering, like, does this person have purpose or not? And he'd probably say no. Combine that with the idea that he thinks it's a good thing that we don't have eternal life because it's the finitude of life that makes it precious.
Which he says in his closing statement.
So does he think someone that gets, let's say, early onset Alzheimer's is the luckiest of us all?
Right.
He has the most finite life. His purpose is over, so he can just get on with leaving early, and then, of course not. I mean, he wouldn't say that.
What about an 8-year-old?
But what about an 8-year-old? But what would be the argument? I mean, if the finitude of life is what makes it precious, then how much more precious the less life you get to live?
Yeah, and so this is, and what you're pointing out is the logical extension of an argument that is a bumper sticker.
Right.
It's the attempt to beautify something that it's the whole proverbial lipstick on a pig. It's a bad worldview. It's a bleak worldview, but if you put enough makeup on it, it looks like it's a real one. That's why I actually respect people like Julian Baggini, who would say that something like, there was that atheist billboard that said, there's probably no God, now stop worrying and enjoy your life. And he says, can you really tell the parents, this is an atheist talking, he says, can you really tell the parents who've lost a child to suicide after years of depression to stop worrying and enjoy their life? His article is entitled "Atheism is Life Can Be Bleak. Atheism is about facing up to that." That's an honesty. That's a rawness. He doesn't try to gussy it up with beautiful sounding things like life is precious because it's rare, because it's finite, or try to gussy up the idea of purpose as being better because you make it. But what if you are incapable of making it?
Yeah.
Then there's a problem. In fact, let me just say this also, is that one of the clips we're not going to play in this reaction video, but as I was looking at the video again, and I would urge every listener and all the viewers to go look at it again, is we're both asked about suicide during the course of the Q&A. And Dan's response is essentially, I'm not a medical or a healthcare provider. I'd hope that you'd see your life as valuable. That's it. That's his answer. Now, I appreciate that because neither one of us is qualified to be a suicide prevention counselor, but that's his response is, I just hope you find purpose in your life and live. But what if you don't? I mean, there's a million things wrong with it. It was an incredibly shallow answer.
It's so built on your reasoning and your free will.
Right.
If you have depression and you don't think you have any purpose in life, is that the reality?
Right.
That
Exactly.
Because it's all based on what can you cognitively understand and grasp and accept.
Yep. And you
So
see
if you decide you don't.
And how many people with that feel that there is no problem to solve? They are the problem to solve. And the best solution would be if I wasn't here. Now what? Now, I'm not saying that's a good solution. It's a terrible solution.
Right.
But I can't see how he avoids that on his worldview. No matter how much makeup you put on it, it still is a cheap imitation of the real thing. So
that's why if you're going to have this view, at least have the courage of Camus to be sad about it.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
Well, so we do get into the once we get into our opening statements and they're done. How the format worked is that Sam Miele was going to quote from us something of our own work, and then we would have a chance to expound upon it, and then the other one would have a chance to respond. So we did talk about morality, about God, and because morality is related to the purpose issue. It really is. And so we talked about that. And so I think in this next clip, we're going to hear some discussion about morality. And what you'll see is that Dan basically says he doesn't really ground morality in something other than harm, the avoidance of harm, but then says, and by the way, Christians really have a problem because the God of the Old Testament's bad.
Well, and I do want to mention too, because some people might be thinking, well, yeah, you're a Christian, so obviously your idea of morality is the Christian God, so isn't that fair for him to bring this up?
Right.
But the point is that you're not there to debate Christianity. You're more there to debate, and now we knew what he was going to bring up, but you're there to debate. It's a theistic argument. It's not, it's a philosophical approach to just how do you epistemically ground the idea that how do you know that you have purpose, or that purpose is even a real thing to have. And so that's kind of for anyone wondering, like, well, why wouldn't you, even for why wouldn't you point to the Bible in your arguments for why we have purpose? We have purpose because of this, because it's not that you don't, but that's not the main thing. Is you're not there to, which you bring up over and over again. This isn't an argument about, this isn't a debate about the Bible. It's not a debate about Christianity. It's a debate about the grounding of purpose.
Right. And to be clear too, as a Christian, I'm not afraid of what the Bible has to say. And so if you avoid it, you look like you're afraid of it. But at the same time, it's a rhetorical trick. It's like, hey, I don't really have a valid philosophical basis for understanding that morality is a real thing. And we're going to find that out later, because someone during the Q&A asks him, where does the ought come from? You ought to do this. Where does that all come from? And he basically dodges it.
It's subject. If you want this thing, you ought to act this way.
Right. And he uses ought in a very, very interesting way, which we can discuss later. But since he has no basis of that, he's got to attack yours. So when the basis of your argument is the other guy's argument's bad, then yours is pretty bad, because you have to do it by comparison. Right. I don't have a good one, but yours is worse. That's not a good argument. That's a fallacious way of argumentation. So what he does is he resorts to the God of the Bible is bad. Now, what I was going to say is that when you're talking about morality and the moral argument, there's a theistic, anybody who believes in a God. A Muslim could say this, for example, is that moral values and duties exist only if God exists. Well, moral values and duties do exist, and therefore God exists. That's a logically valid argument, and you have to prove each one of those premises. But that's just a purely theistic thing. But from there, I think it would be perfectly fine to say, okay, let's say morality does exist. Well, it can't be your version of God who's the ground of that. That's a different argument, but there you have it. So here's where we enter into the morality discussion.
Judging a religion, we judge by their actions. So maybe Christianity is true, maybe Islam is true, but if you're looking at the actions, the actual results of that, and the morality you just described from the so-called conscious mind of your creator cannot be the God of the Bible then.
So there we go. So I didn't give a theist an argument from the Bible. I gave it from the transcendental argument that God, that morality exists if God exists. So he doesn't even address the depth of my argument. He says we judge religions based on how good they are. He creates a false judgment standard, by the way, by how good or effective they are. And then he goes into attacking the Bible.
Because that God caused a lot of harm, the genocides and the pyromania, and he even took credit for raping women. I mean, there's all sorts of actual physical harm being caused, either commanded or committed or condoned by the God that you believe in. And I wrote a whole book about that called God, the Most Unpleasant Character in All Fiction, with more than 1,500 passages showing that the God of the Bible cannot be a basis for moral values, because there is no moral. The only true value in the Bible is obedience, and that's it. And natural organisms, as we evolved, we naturally recoil from harm. If I stick my hand in a fire, I don't have to deliberate and say, I wonder, look at these, that heat is causing these cells to be damaged, and that's going to compromise my ability to function. I think I will conclude that I should pull my hand out of the fire. No, we naturally recoil. As natural organisms, we don't like natural physical harm. And so that is what we are trying to do as as a moral person in a natural moral philosophy, we're trying to have a world that minimizes that actual, measurable, objective harm. And there are different naturalistic moral philosophies. There's utilitarianism, there's like a negative utilitarianism, and there's others. But as long as there exists a workable natural moral philosophy, we can't say that a philosophy based on the immoral principles of the God of a Bible, for example, is better than actually a measurable system.
So he basically just did what we just said, is that he doesn't address the moral argument on its own premises, that moral values and duties exist only if God exists. Those things exist, therefore God exists. He completely dodges it by saying, your God can't be the basis of that. It's almost an implicit sort of acknowledgement of the strength of the argument. And then he goes, and this is the interesting part to me, and this goes to the sort of underlying worldview. He goes that we have a natural instinctual recoil away from physical harm. He doesn't talk about emotional harm. He doesn't talk about spiritual harm. He does in his book, but not in this particular debate. And basically he says we mechanistically recoil from these things, and then we can measure what those things that are harmful and remove it. He never brings in the ought. He just never does it.
Yeah. And what about those who don't recoil?
Yeah.
And do we have any standard on which to say that's good, that's bad?
Right.
Especially from within there. I know we'll talk a little bit. I think we'll get to some social Darwinism too.
Yeah.
But what do you do with that and in those sorts of situations? So yeah, there's a bit there's a lot wanting there, but I think, and we'll eventually, I think we're soon to get into some of his Bible claims as well.
Yeah. Well, one of the things I wanted to pause on though, and when you and I talked about the debate afterwards, this is one of those coulda, shoulda, wouldas. I wish I would have said this in response. Now, I do talk about context, because later on he talks about context and how he was careful with his context and all that stuff. And he he just said in this clip, I believe it was in this clip, where he said that in that book, God, the most unpleasant character in all of fiction, he chronicles 1,500 Bible passages where the God of the Bible inflicts horrible harm.
Yeah.
And he says, hey, I was careful with the context. I did my homework here. I challenge him on that because he clearly didn't. And in fact, later on in the debate, he says something that shows he didn't read the Bible carefully at all. So anyway, you were going to say something about this because
because one of the books that he goes through, the 1,500 verses or whatever he said, and he again, like you said, he made a point to say I was very careful with the context. So in this book, there might be 1,500 verses. They're also covered in 300 pages, essentially.
Yeah.
So if you're doing context on each verse, you'd think you'd have 1,500. Let's say the minimal context, you'd have at least 750 pages.
If you did half a
page on it, but that's not what we have. And if you go through this book again, there's sometimes a little intro. A few of them have a little more context, but it is by and large I'm just going to quote the Bible, and that's what he does a lot. That's kind of his. That's one of his.
But also selectively.
Selectively,
because you can even some of those quotes have the ... the ellipses in them, and the ... matters quite a bit.
Yeah. Well, he does this whole sort of plain reading thing and sort of peppers these Bible verses everywhere. And sometimes that's the rhetorical power of it, that the fact that you have to take so much time explaining what that means is like, see, God should have made it more clear. But, Dan's book, he understands this because the Bible is written clearly to the people it was written to.
Right.
Just like Dan's book was written clearly to the people it was written to, but in 2,000 years, you'll need to do a little bit more explanation of what was going on in the context.
Right.
And that's not what he does. But here's an example of, this is actually from Godless, where he's talking about Numbers 31. And he is, he's talking about Gideon and the Midianites here. And then he goes to something 6 chapters later. He says, first in talking about Gideon and the Midianites, he said, the Lord spake unto Moses, saying, vex the Midianites and smite them. So I love the translation he's using. Yeah. He then quotes from 6 chapters later, where the women and children are saved though the men are slaughtered. But he says it's not the happy ending people think.
Mm-hmm.
So he says, and Moses was wroth with the officers, ... And Moses said unto them, have ye saved all the women alive? Now therefore kill every male among the little ones, and kill every woman that hath known man by lying with him. But all the women children that have not known a man by lying with him, keep alive for yourselves. So that sounds pretty bad. What he leaves out, this is Numbers 31, verses 14 through 18. He leaves out verse 16.
Mm-hmm.
It's literally the context for the whole thing.
Yeah. Yeah.
And verse 16 is, they were the, so, and Moses was wroth with the officers. They were the ones who followed Balaam's advice and enticed the Israelites to be unfaithful to the Lord in the Peor incident, so that a plague struck the Lord's people.
Mm-hmm.
Let me check something real quick. Sorry.
And I'll just say this because, by the way, having just read this in my devotions actually recently, what the context is that the officers, and amongst other people, had led people to actually start to worship other gods. And those gods were child sacrificing gods. Those were temple prostitution gods. Those were gods who commanded horrible things, including leading people away from the God of Israel, who had delivered them from the hands of the Egyptians. So you have a lot of context as to why it was evil for these people to do these things. And this was a judgment against those people for having done those things. And that one verse sets the entire context for the chapters ahead before it.
Yeah, and it's and by the way, I misstated a little bit. In my notes I had it wrong, but verse 16 comes right after it says, "Have ye saved all the women alive?" Mm-hmm. So it gives the context for who are the women that is being talked about. Because his whole thing is, look at what they are killing the women actually, but there's a specific thing that is being guarded against when it talks about that.
Yeah.
That these were the ones who followed Balaam's advice and enticed the Israelites to be unfaithful. And we'll talk a little bit more about that because there's something. Dan has an issue with child sacrifice and human sacrifice. Every single instance of these things, when they're saying, here's the problem, whether it's women or other people coming in, the problem is not race mixing or anything like that. The problem is them bringing their customs with them, and they would actually influence Israel. And one of the major things that's always brought up in those lists of things is child sacrifice. This is what God was protecting them from. So that's important to keep in mind too, because child sacrifice will feature a lot in a lot of these passages about why are these people being treated so brutally? Well, they were doing brutal things and they were influencing others to do that. And that was a very entrenched view in the ancient world, to sacrifice children to please the gods, which in the Old Testament over and over again, Yahweh's against that.
Right, over and over again, and it's never a good thing.
And this is why context will be important for everything.
Yeah, and he skips it. Yeah. And like you said, in that instance, the ... and then here we go again, where he doesn't address the moral argument. He just says, hey, your God can't be the God. That's the basis for morality. And my point in bringing this up, too, not only is to show that he leaves things out of context. And like I said, when we were having our back and forth after the debate, I said, I wish I had said 1,500 passages with careful context. Your book is far less than 1,500 pages, which means you didn't even give one page to every verse you cite, or even half a page, because it's not 700 words. So tell me about context again.
Well, and well, I think it's just to hammer it home a bit too. Even along with that, he made a choice to take out that verse.
Yeah,
I'd like to know why.
Yeah, exactly. And
I know why.
Yeah,
I'd like for him to admit why.
Yeah, exactly. I'd love to admit exactly why. And he goes on about how careful he was, but he gets caught later not being careful with something. So there you have it. But one of the things that's important is that what you'll see throughout the debate, and if you watch it or listen to it, you'd see that one of the things Dan does repeatedly, despite being told not to do it, at least once by the moderator, is when you get into the weeds about these things, you're veering off the topic. But Dan's known for this, and he can't help it. And it's also, in his view, probably his strongest arguments. So, in fact, he goes into it again here.
if you're right about Imago Dei, then that Dei cannot be the biblical God because of the values expressed by that being.
So just pause real quick, because he says, if you're right about Imago Dei, the image of God, then because I talked about the values of human beings being based in God's, being made in God's image, that's what makes us objectively valuable. And he's basically saying, yeah, but if it's an image of this God, that can't be the basis. So once again, he doesn't address the issue directly. But because I did quote the Bible essentially, Genesis 1:27, he goes after him. Yeah.
But I agree with you. People should be judged by their actions. There's a lot of bad everybody. A lot of bad Christians, a lot of bad Jews. There's some bad atheists in the world. And how do we say that? Why do we say there's bad ones? Because of their actions, of how they are causing unnecessary harm. We can measure that. We can see that. And I kind of like the way you phrase it, but what you're actually describing is humanism. Humans have inherent worth, and that's what humanism says. The Bible doesn't say that. Nowhere in the Bible do you find anything that the human beings have an inherent dignity to their own self-worth. In the Bible, humans are sinners and worms and submissive slaves to the master who's going to punish them if they don't.
So right there, I'm going to pause, because the first, if it's not as, the audio wasn't as clear because my mic wasn't on at the time in full measure. He said, there's nowhere in the Bible where humans are talked about in terms of intrinsic worth. And the first thing that came to my mind was, what is man that you are mindful of him, or the Son of Man that you care for him? You have made him a little lower than the heavenly beings, yet crowned him with honor and glory and given him dominion. So I said, did you not read Psalm 8? Psalm 8 is one of the most famous passages of the Bible across denominations, all that stuff. And he says nowhere in the Bible is this stated. And in this particular place, it is. Psalm 139, we are fearfully and wonderfully made. There is obviously a poetic way in which he says you are inherently valuable. Genesis 1:27, we're made in God's image. Matthew chapter 5, and you see it over and over again, where Jesus talks about the fact that God takes care of the sparrows, and not one of them falls to the ground without him noticing it. The numbers on your head, the numbers of the hairs on your head, the hairs on your head are numbered. The flowers of the fields are clothed even more than Solomon. Are you not worth more than these? I'm sorry, but you claim to be a preacher. What did you preach exactly? What were you preaching? If you said nowhere in the Bible does it say that. In the Sermon on the Mount, in some of the most important passages in the history of Christian understanding of what Jesus meant, is all about human dignity and value over and over again. So I had to pause there because
it is even in the Bible too. The Bible, again, this is something that the early church got really was right about, and even Luther was right about. Sometimes we have this idea of, that sin nature is something inherent to human nature, and it's not. That's why Luther kind of had a problem with that terminology,
right?
And saying like, oh, I messed up, I'm only human. It's like, well, no, that's not what it means.
Yeah,
to be human. The Bible talks a lot about it is your actions and giving into certain things. Like there is a tendency, your heart tends toward rebellion, then your actions reinforce that rebellion. So it's still action oriented, but can he really look at someone who's been a career criminal and say that they're not getting worse internally because of what they're doing externally? And we can be compassionate about the fact that people start at different places in life and maybe forced into something because of that, and maybe they didn't have but it's also people who are affluenza, who are born with all this wealth and are spoiled, also that can turn their heart to something else. So this is a problem for all of us. It's not really either or. It's not that the Bible just says you were created evil, and he does use the Isaiah 45:7 God created evil thing in his book, which we've talked about before, and that's not what it says. If you got out of the KJV, actually, a lot of these things would probably clear up.
Yeah, probably. There's plenty of things that would.
But anyway, just wanted to kind of.
And just as another aside, by the way, is that the idea that he says, the Bible says you're a worm, you're depraved, you're all these things. That doesn't mean you're not valuable.
Right.
In fact, in Romans chapter 5, verse 8, a passage I would presume a 19-year veteran of preaching would know, where it says, "For God demonstrates his love for us," which was also described as from everlasting to everlasting, and that he loves us with an everlasting love. For God demonstrates his love for us, and that while we were yet sinners, Christ died for us. Why would he die for us if he weren't inherently valuable? The whole thing falls apart if you just read the Bible a little bit.
Yeah.
So here we go with the rest of the clip.
There are some good passages in the Bible, of course.
I mean, you said nowhere in the Bible. I beg to differ, Dan. Context is important. Do your homework.
Thank you for that lesson. I will reread Psalm 8.
I hope so.
We all have a lot to learn.
I do too.
But I had a lot of questions for you too, but Sam doesn't want us to get into the scripture too much. I'll just put it out there and let's not talk about it. The way Moses treated Korah, for example, for his question, the way Phinehas was rewarded for murdering a mixed race couple and so on, and there's all these stories in there based on the command of this God that we're supposed to be created in his image. But what you described is basic humanism. In our country, you're American too. The consent of the governed is an important part of our country. But you don't find consent of the governed anywhere. You don't find democracy in the Bible. You don't find any of those enlightened principles in those books or in that religion. You find it in Enlightenment humanistic principles, which you are describing in religious terms. You're free to do that. But don't you also understand that those of us who don't buy into your supernatural worldview also have a naturalistic way to explain what you're trying to explain in a supernatural way? It works for us, and there's a lot of non-believers who think, why do we even need that supernatural framework when we can have a life of purpose and value as real human beings in the real world? So.
Yeah, I see what you're saying, Dan. I do get it. But I guess it goes back to me is a couple of things that just spring to mind. And I'm not going to remember track of everything we talked about. By the way, there's explanations on the Phineas thing, amongst other things, but it's not about a mixed race couple. It's not even close to being about that. Moses was married to a Midianite, and it was fine with God.
And he told the Israelites, don't mix with the Midianites. He said, don't mix with them.
Let's stick to the
So
topic
it was a
of
mixed
discussion.
race. It was a mixed group.
Yep, Moses married one, and it was okay. Anyway.
All right. So without playing the entirety of the clip, the whole point here is that, one, on the Phinehas thing, he goes in and says Phineas was rewarded for killing a Midianite woman because she was Midianite,
Right.
Because a Hebrew had brought her into the camp, and he was going to marry her, and so Phineas killed her, and that somehow is this reward because she's not one of them. And you read the context earlier on in Numbers, where the whole context was these officers were bringing in these women and they were mixing with the Midianites, not because of their ethnicity, but because of their practices.
Yeah, well,
That's a key distinction, and that's the point of why Moses could marry a Midianite woman, Zipporah, and can marry her, and she can actually sit in judgment of Moses at one point and say to him, you have not done the right thing by me or by yourself earlier on in their marriage. And Moses is corrected by her, and he's like, okay, I see your point and all that. And her father, Jethro, who is a Midianite, would give Moses advice. So you see the whole corpus of Scripture. Again, this is context. You see this context, and then he says, well, because she's Midianite, it's a mixed race thing, and therefore that's awful. That's not the point. The point was at this point, the Midianites, unlike Zipporah, unlike Jethro, were actually worshiping false gods and causing the Israelites the Hebrews to actually worship these false gods, and that caused the plague. So in the middle of the plague, in the middle of all the terrible things that happen, this priest, who should know better, brings a Midianite into the camp and basically flouts God. He basically sticks his middle finger up at God, if you will, and says, I'm burying this woman anyway. Yeah. And they're both the ones who are leading them astray.
And it's at a specific time where, again, Israel's still struggling with Baal worship.
Yeah.
So he's trying to keep out. By the way, you say, oh, well, what's so bad about worshiping other gods? Again, these are the gods that are getting people to sacrifice children to them. There's explicit context given in those verses with Phinehas, where it says, this is Numbers 25, that God's anger is because of this. The people began to, I'm going to use a little Old Testament language here. The people began to whore with the daughters of Moab. These invited the people to the sacrifice of the gods. This is essentially demon worship. So you can say you think it's wrong. There's no such thing as demons. So if this really happened, it was just evil. But within the logic of Scripture,
Right.
which is the important thing here, within the logic of the narrative being told, it's not because of a mixed race couple. There were times when Israel wasn't allowed to intermarry with other cultures. Oftentimes because of their proximity, their size, like the Canaanites, you could intermarry with other cultures, but not this one. They will be too big of an influence. You bring that one in here, she's got a powerful family right on the other side of the camp,
Right.
and they're really influential. And along with that, we know, because there are a lot of positive examples in the Old Testament of foreigners joining Israel, not just intermarrying, but just joining. There's the mixed multitude in the Exodus. There's laws about treating foreigners well, which shows they're there. There's, you mentioned Moses and his marriage, Rahab becoming a part of Israel, Ruth the Moabite becomes David's great-grandmother. How does she do that?
Right. And yeah.
Uriah the Hittite was one of David's mighty men. Okay, there's a bit more to that story, but
But he's not an Israelite.
But he's not an Israelite.
Right.
He's there. There's there's countless more examples.
And these folks, by the way, make it into, not all of them, but a lot of them make it into Jesus's genealogy.
Right.
So
Yeah.
the genealogy of the Messiah, God esteems these non-Israelites so highly that he mentions them in the genealogy of the Savior of the world.
Yeah.
So if you're going to attack the morality of the God of the Bible, then take the God of the Bible on the terms that are that define the God of the Bible in terms of his actions and his words.
Yeah.
Don't make up a standard that he doesn't apply to himself and then hold him to that standard. If you're going to attack him on his words, then take him at all his words, not some of his words.
Yeah, and I wanted to also just briefly kind of touch on, because again, it shows to me that I think Dan is open to scholarship that agrees with him, and not open to scholarship that doesn't. And I feel like, or maybe he's because if you read a book, and I don't know because I have not delved too deeply into this, but I would imagine, let's say you read a book by Steven Pinker on the Enlightenment. It's not probably going to be all that favorable to Christian.
It's not. I read it. It's not.
Okay. But when you read more, like, we're just historians looking into it, it's somewhat more neutral. Sometimes they're Christians, sometimes they're atheists. And they're really just more concerned about the truth of history, it seems to me. You get a much more nuanced picture. Because I thought it was basically everyone knows that Enlightenment and humanistic values come from a Christian past. Now, you can say that, well, they didn't have to, or we would have come to this anyway. We could have gotten them eventually from other things. You can make all those arguments. But through whatever accidents of history, it came through Christianity. Dan doesn't give that. I have some scholars here I'd like him to...
Yeah, well, I'd love to hear them,
yeah.
because two of the ones that come to my mind, just off the top of my head, are John Gray, an atheist, who, in response to Steven Pinker's book, Enlightenment Now, basically says this over-romantification of the Enlightenment thinkers, many of whom were in favor of slavery, were crazy misogynists, and in some senses could border on nihilistic in some ways. It's like, why'd you leave them out? When you say Enlightenment, we have this sort of super hyper-generalized view of it, but also plenty of the Enlightenment thinkers were devoted Christians.
Yeah.
And so somehow they get left out, and it's completely secular, completely humanistic. That's why he says these are humanistic values. The best and most influential Enlightenment thinkers were either Christians or atheists influenced by Christians, and some of the bad ones we leave out when we talk about human values. Well, is enslaving people a human value? Maybe the answer is yes. Maybe that's part of the reason why we're beset with this sinful condition, beyond the sinful nature thing. But the sinful condition we find ourselves in is that we keep on enslaving each other. Well, that's an Enlightenment value. Why do you get to pick and choose which ones you like? So if you're going to rely on it, then maybe we should actually be consistent in doing so.
Yeah. So here is Tom Holland, who we've talked about, atheist, agnostic, I think he would say now. He's maybe moved more towards agnosticism. but not a Christian. And he says, he writes, the twin traditions of Britain and France, of enthusiasts for the spirit and enthusiasts for reason, had joined in amity even before the first cannon was fired at Waterloo. The irony was one that neither Protestants nor atheists cared to dwell upon, that an age of enlightenment and revolution had served to establish as international law a principle that derived from the depths of the Catholic past. Increasingly, it was in the language of human rights that Europe would proclaim its values to the world. Now there were plenty of Protestant influences and Protestants involved in the Enlightenment as well. But what you'll see when I get to some other quotes too is that all this talk of human rights, there are the building blocks that you get from the scriptures that then get kind of worked around through Christian history and then through legal scholars in the medieval Catholic Church. It turns into this other thing.
Yeah.
Another person, Jens Zimmerman, a philosopher who specializes in the roots of humanism, and he's traced it back to as far back as the early church and into the scriptures. He says, Enlightenment humanism, with its belief in universal reason and its confidence in the moral progress of humanity, is itself a secular offshoot of a deeper Christian anthropology. ... This one you can trust. He says later, the Enlightenment is itself a child of Christianity, a rationalist abstraction of an unacknowledged Christian idea. So-called Enlightenment values such as social welfare and human rights, with foundational conceptions of human dignity, freedom, agency, rationality, and personhood, all go back to Christian roots. By Christian roots, I do not mean a general notion of cultural Christianity, but specific Christian doctrines. Perhaps the most important of these is the Christian doctrine of the incarnation. That's why he has this book called Incarnational Humanism for that reason. Brian Tierney, who's an English historian and medievalist, he said that the modern idea of natural rights probably arose explicitly in the 12th century church lawyers, those theologians interested in canon law who he says, quote, played an important innovatary. Hold on, I'm going to have to learn that. Innovatary.
Okay.
Innovatary.
I'll buy it.
Role. Sorry, you ever just have your mind stop working? And then, so Larry Seidentop, who wrote a whole book on the sort of it's called Inventing the Individual, the Origins of Western Liberalism. He said, secularism is Christianity's gift to the world, Europe's noblest achievement. I would question
Noblest?
As
a grammatical thing, not the substance of it being the noblest.
I think I would probably question the substance of secularism being the noblest.
Oh, I thought I misunderstood. Okay, never mind. Yeah.
So he's a big fan of secularism.
Oh, I thought he was using the Christian values as noblest.
But he says, and he says this later, yet if Paul and Augustine conjured up a vision of moral freedom, it was the 12th century canonists who converted that vision into the formal legal system founded on natural rights. And Tim O'Neill, writing for History of Atheists website, which is a great website, correcting a lot of bad history like Dan Barker and other new atheists have. Tim is himself an atheist. He reviewed Tom Holland's book, Making the Claims we just went through, and I just thought it was interesting. He just said it was interesting, provocative, and overall convincing, and most reviewers found it the same way. So Holland's book made a big splash too. So if you're not conversant with it, or at least trying to deny it, you're ignoring it. I think you're purposely ignoring it. These are not hard people to find, and so to say that, I think, is just ignoring the history.
Well, this goes back to the idea of prep. Is you're ignoring the history, you're ignoring thinkers on your side of things who are saying, look, like John Steinrucken's a good example too of somebody who said, look, the 10 Commandments are the basis for morality for the entirety of Western culture. Yes, they refer to Middle Eastern culture, but we can't say that these didn't have a tremendous influence on Western cultural development. He said the consent of the governed. Os Guinness would beg to differ. He talks a lot about the fact that God would speak from the mountain and the people would respond and say, we hear and will adhere to these commandments. So there is this sense of the consent of the governed as well. choose this day who you will serve. There's all these kind of things going on. But John Steinrucken, he misses him. He misses Marcelo Pera. I actually quote Marcelo Pera during the course of our debate, who is a philosopher, an atheist, and an Italian statesman. And he made the point, he said, you had this picture of Madame Allard, a French actress, sort of depicting the French Revolution, and she shouts with the flag behind her, liberté, égalité, fraternité, liberty, brotherhood, and freedom. Liberty, equality, and freedom, and brotherhood, I should say. I'll get it right eventually. And he says, were these words invented by her, or is she merely quoting the principles that find themselves in that charming little booklet? He's referring to the New Testament. Mm-hmm. He says, what this shows is that the Enlightenment was not novel, but that it was late. Mm-hmm. It borrowed from these things, and this is an atheist saying it. This goes back to the prep thing, and this is an important, I think, principle for all of us. If you don't follow the scholarship, or at least engage with it meaningfully, you're just speaking to your audience. And the reason why that makes for bad debate prep is because it makes, and I hate to say it in this almost condescending way, but I really do mean this, it makes for bad life prep. If you're not willing to engage other people's thoughts seriously, thoughtfully, especially when they're on your side seemingly, but they concede some points, and you're the head of the Freedom from Religion Foundation, where there's teams of lawyers and you're suing people all the time, as Dan is the head of, you're suing people all the time for violations of church and state, well, then I would hope that there'd be some legal preparation and some scholarship behind this kind of a thing. And so what we have to do is make sure that we don't fall into the same trap of not preparing for not only not debates, but not preparing for life and understanding the big issues of life in our day-to-day. Not so that you can sit on a stage and have a microphone in your hand and talk about things, but so that you engage in the search for truth. That's the real lesson here. Yeah. So this next clip is about the problem of evil, and we respond to it. And I think it's pertinent to the purpose thing, because thwarting evil is part of a purpose, and therefore evil has to exist. Mm-hmm. Let's play this clip, because there's a couple of things I think are worth responding to here.
In order to say that evil disproves God, you have to basically assume that there is unjustified evil in the world. So the argument might go like this. If unjustifiable suffering exists, then God probably doesn't exist. Unjustifiable suffering exists, therefore God probably doesn't exist. That's the argument. But that's a modus ponens kind of argument. But you can turn it into a modus tollens and see the problem. Premise one, if unjustifiable suffering exists, God probably doesn't exist. God exists, therefore unjustifiable suffering doesn't exist. That is a logically valid argument. So now the question is, which premise are you arguing about? If it's premise 2, in the atheistic framework, it's unjustifiable suffering exists. You have to prove that. You can't just say that, you have to prove that. And in mine, it's God exists. Can't just say that, got to prove that. I would very much rather be in my position on that one, because the burden of proof to say that if a God exists, God, an omnipotent, all-powerful God can't possibly exist in the world with unjustified suffering. You have to prove that that suffering is unjustified. What that means is you have to assume that you have all the resources available to God in terms of all the circumstances and all these things, and then exhaustively know everything there could possibly be in order to disprove that God, to shore up premise 2, which is unjustifiable suffering exists. And you simply can't do that. The burden of proof on that is astronomically high. I would much rather I think it's much harder, I should say, to try to prove that you're God than that God doesn't exist. So I was talking about the idea of unjustifiable suffering. But if I could, as we interact on this, I'd like to just come back on a couple of things. I really do think that there is something that's a little more less than just a philosophical argument on that.
Okay, thank you. Dan, I'm going to give you a couple minutes here, so feel free and I'll jump in.
Now, before we move on, I just want to say that the reason I set this argument up the way I did, and by the way, I got this, I was watching something and it was Pints with Aquinas. And great podcast. And so I got that argument essentially from somebody else. Honestly, I cannot remember. As we're sitting here, I wrote the note down who it was, but he was talking about this. And he said, so this is the argument. And he says the argument is that if unjustifiable suffering exists, God is unlikely to exist. unjustifiable suffering exists, therefore God is unlikely to exist. He says that middle part, you have to prove that. He says, and I can show it by inverting the argument into what's called modus tollens, which is just a formal way of talking about how arguments work. And he says, what I just said was the formulation, which is, if unjustifiable suffering exists, God is unlikely to exist. God exists, therefore unjustifiable suffering doesn't exist. That's logically valid too. So now we have competing premises, because the first one's identical. So the second one is unjustifiable suffering exists or God exists. You have to pick which one you want to try to prove.
Yeah.
And if you try to prove that unjustifiable suffering exists, you have to know everything to know that any instance or all instances of suffering are not justifiable. You have to know everything to do that. But there's great arguments other than just your belief that God exists. And if it's even slightly probable that God exists, then unjustifiable suffering doesn't exist. So I got that argument from somebody else. I want to make sure I give credit to somebody else for that. Can't remember the name to save my life, but it was on Pints with Aquinas. If you look it up, I'm sure you'll find it.
Do you remember the rough time frame? Was
I
a
saw
recent
it.
podcast? Or?
Yeah, I saw it probably 20 minutes. I probably saw it 3 or 4 weeks before this debate.
Okay.
And this debate took place in, I want to say April.
Okay.
So look for it. It's really quite good.
Yeah.
And now this is Dan's response to my argument.
When we want to converse on it.
So one of the problems with your syllogism there is that it's not falsifiable. There's no way to test. There's no way to actually know whether the suffering is unjustifiable in the big picture. When God told the Israel,
So I want to stop and say that. Right.
Correct. Yeah, that's
Yes. Exactly, Dan. That's
not the
point.
problem with your syllogism. That's the problem with, I don't know if he uses it, but the syllogism of people who agree with him.
Right.
Yeah.
He's saying you can't possibly prove whether the suffering is justifiable or not, which means that you have a huge burden of proving it. And you're saying you can't prove it or disprove it. You can't.
Yeah.
Therefore, suffering can never be an argument against God's existence.
Right.
It just can't be. Now, what happens in the rest of the clip, and I just want to cut it off for brevity's sake, because the whole point was to show that he didn't understand the argument. In fact, when he didn't understand the argument, he gave the argument its actual force and conceded my point to me. When he goes on for the rest of this, because he can't deal with the argument, he says, oh, by the way, God is bad. He does it again, because in the rest of this response, what he says is, when God commands the Israelites to kill a pregnant Canaanite woman, by the way, that doesn't say that exactly, but when he's thrusting the sword through her, she thinks this is terrible, but this Israelite is like, no, this is all for some greater good. It's justifiable. She's not going to know that. Well, first of all, that's irrelevant. And I hate to say it this way, but on the logic of it, it is irrelevant whether the sufferer knows if the harm is justified or not. It's logically irrelevant. Now, might it be good if they did know that? Yeah, but it might not be possible for us to know why any instance of suffering is occurring for some greater possible good. It's just something that not only might God keep it from us for whatever reason, but if I think about it, an infinite God who knows everything and is omnipotent and omnipresent, we're not talking about him knowing a few more things than us. We're talking about an infinitely wiser mind. What makes us think that we would even possibly comprehend any justification without going mad, having known the answer? Because we wouldn't even be able to conceive of it. Yeah. So that's what I was getting at. And by the way, I did mention something about suffering being more than just philosophical, because I did want to address if someone feels harm, like he brings up God is bad, and that's his response. Having gone through suffering of my own, and I know I have, everyone's gone through it and wondered why. There's at least a modicum of an answer, if not a really profound answer, in the Christian faith versus his, which is just like, it just happens. That's all there is to it, I guess. There you go. So that's the point of bringing this clip up as well. So we can move on unless you have something to respond to.
No, I think that's
pretty
much.
When he gave it away, he said, you can't know that. I'm like, that's the point, exactly the point.
Yeah.
That's why the argument is such a good argument,
Yeah.
and why I love the way he took that modus ponens argument, turned it into modus tollens to show that you really can't get there.
And a lot of these arguments bank on the emotionalism of it too. So
Yeah.
people do greatly dislike evil and they want answers for it. And so they can kind of play on that.
Yeah.
And that's, I think, what that argument always does, because everyone, I think, wants to emotionally unjustifiable suffering is what it feels like, and what we want to call it a lot of the time, that we can't fathom a reason.
Right.
And, you know, there may not be a specific reason. It might be a general reason. Again, whatever the case may be. And it plays on that. But then I think that's just a great example of showing, again, you're just saying his argument, and that was the argument he had a problem with.
Yeah. He doesn't have a problem with my argument. He has a problem with his.
Yeah.
And okay, I'm good with you having a problem with your own argument.
Yeah.
But I wanted to pause that because it was a little on the more philosophically formal
yeah.
side, but it was important to talk about
Yep.
that. So, okay, so let's see. This next clip is, I think, really begins to expose a fundamental contradiction in the whole point of Dan's position from a materialistic framework about when it comes to free will and how that undermines his idea that we can have any purpose at all. Because remember his premise, we don't have purpose of life. There's no objective purpose. There's only purpose in life, and that's the purpose we give it, and we do that willfully. So here's the problem.
In one of your books, you say this, you said, I consider free will to be an illusion, which means I'm a determinist. Determinists generally deny free will because we can't accept the fact that everything, including our brains and minds, is determined by the laws of nature. There is no wiggle room to sneak out of the laws of cause and effect. However, I differ slightly from some strict determinists who think that free will is a pernicious delusion. I think it is actually a useful fiction, somewhat like a sunrise. The morality that you're subjecting God to and judging him on is based in and entails free will. Yet you just got done saying that free will is a fiction. It's an illusion. It's not real. And everything you do and say is cause and effect, and there's no wiggle room out of it, which means that everything you just said is based on your brain chemistry, your biochemistry, and all the causes that attain to your being here and my being here. So you don't really come to moral conclusions or moral reasoning. I'm glad you do, by the way, but on your view, you don't, and neither do I, and neither do they. None of you do. So every time you judge God or Christianity or anything as immoral, you're not doing it based on moral reasoning, you're doing it based on brain chemistry. So I can't see how it is you justify making moral claims at all, other than just saying it's instinctual. I'm a human, humans shouldn't suffer because I'm a human. And
Now, Dan, in his response, actually didn't address it specifically. He does talk about free will being an illusion, but it's useful like a sunrise. The sun doesn't actually rise. You know, this is more of a contradiction thing where he says the thing you think is what you're seeing is actually not what you're seeing. It's something else. But he never actually addresses the issue. He addresses it sort of later, but I wanted to play this clip because this was the part of the problem, is that he uses over and over again a moral standard to judge the God of the Bible as being an immoral character, but he doesn't actually believe morality exists other than avoid harm, and which he says we ought to, but he never justifies why we ought to. He just says we should because we have a preference for it. Well, that's not really a moral argument. That's just a statement of speciesism. You know, ants would rather not suffer harm, but do we consider ants to be moral creatures? I mean, we certainly don't. And if he does, and he does later on say that we're basically animals, he keeps reducing us down to computers and animality. No matter how hard he tries, he keeps making us worse, which means that we don't actually have purpose. We just have programming.
Right.
All right, so this next clip.
Yeah, I love the next clip.
Yeah, let's go to this one and see what gems we can glean from this one.
Jericho was just a peaceful city. They were not threatening, and yet they were all massacred. Why? So that God's special people could have a place to live. That is reprehensible. That is immorally inexcusable, that is genocide, that is colonialism based by God's people, I can judge it. You can judge it when you see it happen, when actual harm is being committed, either in or not in the name of God. We can do that as natural beings. And even if we don't have some, immaterial excuse for it, we are biological organisms. Therefore, we do suffer biologically in this biological world. And even if it's an illusion, morality is a very useful illusion. Like you read my book, depth perception is an illusion, but it's useful. It helps us navigate the world. So the illusion of free will, in my opinion, and not all atheists agree with me, obviously, is a very useful fiction, a very useful illusion that helps us navigate making moral decisions as a social species.
But do you see the nested contradictions in that? Is that free will doesn't actually exist, and you are just cause and effect. And you said it's useful for us making decisions, but you don't make decisions.
Yes, you do make decisions. A computer makes decisions, right?
Okay.
Computers make decisions. They come to a point. They
They make calculations, Dan. That's different.
No, not necessarily.
About a minute, 2 minutes to respond.
All right.
Sure.
A couple things to
Yeah,
discuss
but
here.
this was one of those things where him stating his case actually proves my case. We don't make decisions. Yes, we do. We do like computers. They don't make decisions. I don't care how fancy Claude and ChatGPT and all these things get. They're not making decisions.
Yeah.
They're making probability
They've been
determined
programmed
calculations,
to-
and they're programmed to do that. They don't suddenly decide to write a sonnet on their own. And so he gives me the case. We're computers.
Yeah.
That's my point. My point is, he kept on saying, we're just a hammer on my view, on a Christian worldview, is that if God determines our purpose, we're just a tool. And then he says, we're computers. What is a computer? It's a tool. So he keeps on undermining his own case over and over again. Anyway.
Yeah, well, and just to point out too, again, because the context matters, being up with the scholarship matters if you need to be, because some of these things were lost to time. So Jericho, not a peaceful city. It's a military.
Where did he get this from?
A military outpost. This has been known for a long time. Richard Hess, Old Testament scholar, actually even talks about the fact that it was probably a city like other. It's on the edge of the territory, and it's like other military outpost cities like that were actually there to guard you against getting to the civilian population. There would not be civilians there except for a few there to render certain services, maybe cooks, maybe other things.
Blacksmiths, you name it. Yeah,
Rahab was there
Yeah,
doing something. Maybe she ran a tavern. We don't know.
Yeah, we don't know.
Exactly the wording is, but she may have done something.
She didn't hold a
else.
spear, and she wasn't holding a shield.
Yeah. And again, they would, if they see this coming, they could have, I'm sure, easily evacuated, whatever. But the point is, when you're going there, you're not thinking, oh, we're here to kill all these people and the servants who are, these few women. I mean, sometimes the terminology, because of the hyperbole of the Old Testament, will say that. But again, you can look at the hyperbole, see what actually happens, see the difference between the two, and saying, okay, that must be hyperbole because Joshua's praised for doing this thing that doesn't look like what he was told to do.
Right, and I point that out, that kill every man, woman, and child, and then Joshua did all as Moses commanded, but then there's women, children, and men running around. So he clearly didn't do that. He wiped out their way of life because that was the whole point, is the evil influence there. But this idea that Jericho was this peaceful city just minding its own business, it's essentially a fort.
And that's the same for the other Haram cities. It's that idea that, and actually, so I mean, you can't line it up with every city, but Michael Heiser even talked about it was where there were these sightings of giants again, which is what the spies reported.
Right.
And Joshua was saying, we can still beat them because we've got God on our side. And they're like, oh, we don't know about this.
Right.
Which is why they wandered the desert for
yeah, exactly.
But anyway, the point is, it's not even always because of, possibly, depending on your view of that thing, it's not even always because of humans there. But and Haram, we'll get into perhaps a little bit later. It's not always about disaster, destruction either.
Right.
That's a translation issue that, again, we all know this now.
Yeah, and he should know it.
This is readily available.
Yeah, and it's not like it's like a couple of weeks old.
Right.
It's been around for a while.
Yeah.
If we've known this. When I was not a Christian, and I was looking at what I thought were contradictions in the Bible, because of people like Dan, I found the counter, and I interacted with it, and it led me to faith, as opposed to just ignoring it because it's not convenient.
Yeah.
Now, this next clip's a little on the longer side, but I'm going to play it because it really does go to the heart of the contradiction, even beyond the morality thing. It goes to the heart of the contradiction inherent in Dan's position here.
In your book, you say, quote, "If you don't have the freedom to choose, to strive for your own goals, then you are not really alive." You've said this before. You are just a hammer. If you think your purpose must come from outside yourself, you are a slave to another mind, which you've alluded to. That is exactly what most religions teach. I'd like you to elaborate on that in the defense of your view for the audience, and then I'm going to do the same thing, Abdu, with you, as I have a quote for you as well. Take about a minute or 2 minutes here, Dan.
So again, I think we pretty much touched on that. I mean, we could talk around it some more, but basically that's what most religions do teach. You must die to yourself, and
praise
lean
God.
not on your own understanding. And Paul instructs Christians to become slaves of Christ and to obey what someone else tells them. And in that case, I'm not saying you're not free to do that. If you want to be a slave, you're welcome to be. If you want to submit yourself, if you like working on the plantation under the plantation owners, then that's your freedom. That's your choice to do that. But it's not your purpose then. It's something that you have surrendered. In fact, the New Testament talks about surrendering yourself unto God. So you can do that. Abdu can do that. But there are others of us who don't want to do that. We want to have a revolutionary war. We want to rebel proudly and happily rebel against King George and against the usurpations and the injustices that were being foisted upon us. So this really is a matter of choice, and we don't have free will. We don't have libertarian free will. That's just completely impossible. That means that you can violate the laws of cause and effect. Your brain evolved with brain cells that are functioning according to just the laws of nature, and you think something spooky is above it that can change who you didn't choose who you are, or you didn't choose your mathematical or sports abilities or reason. You were basically handed that because of the evolutionary process of your ancestors. You can't change that. You don't.
In other words, it came from outside you.
Don't have, and even if there is such a thing as libertarian free will that somehow transcends the natural world in some spooky way, that itself is determined. It's not just some random thing. Even libertarian free will is itself deterministic if not by some known physical laws, by some other perhaps metaphysical or supernatural laws that's determining what that is. So you can't escape determinism by moving up another level.
Yeah, you can. I mean, if the creator of the entire universe, he's not a being among beings. He is the being through whom all other things have their being, determines that I should have free will, then I have it.
Yeah.
And because he is the grounding of all of existence, he's not beholden to any laws other than that which is inherent in his nature. So God is beholden only to himself, not because these things exist outside of him, but because he is the source of all existence. So he's not a slave to anything either. He's not determined. He is the necessary being who determines everything. And he determines that I'm going to be able to have libertarian free will. So that's just not an issue there. As well. But you notice the inherent contradiction right there. He says it's a matter of, you can choose to be a slave or not. Some of us want to rebel. It's a matter of choice. And then in a second and a half later, he says it's a matter of choice, but we don't have free will.
Yeah. Well, I thought we did because we're computers, but now we're back to not having them. It's depending on the argument he needs to make at that moment, in that second.
Yeah.
Because he switched back and forth. But it is this, because one of the things you will bring up later towards the end of the debate is this idea, because you point out on his perspective, I think you even say, like, you're not the person wielding the hammer, you are the hammer.
No, actually what I say is that you're not the person wielding the hammer. You're not a hammer, you're a nail.
Oh yeah, you're a nail. You're a nail.
And causality is the hammer.
Right.
And it keeps nailing you
Yeah.
over and over again. So on his worldview, the slavery he's trying to rebel from is worse. Because if I choose to surrender myself to the source of all existence, to the ground of all existence, the personal God who cares for me and would do anything to have redeem the relationship I've forsaken, if I choose to surrender to that God, and I say, you're clearly a higher being than me and want my best interest and I'm limited, that's a perfectly rational and warranted surrender. His surrender is not even volitional. There's no volition to surrender anyway. So we are all slaves to causality. And it's blind, mindless, pitiless, and indifferent, to quote his good friend Richard Dawkins. His slavery is way worse than anything he's claiming we're a slave to. It's just way worse.
And just to clear up too, like no one is saying even. I mean, I think sometimes, it's because they sort of focus on either you're determined or there's libertarian free will, but there's nothing in between those two things.
Yeah.
And obviously, we're made up of there's nature, there's nurture, there's also decisions to be made. You can go against how you were raised growing up. You can go against your urges. That was C.S. Lewis's whole point, is that there are sometimes, we give into impulses, but there are sometimes where the right thing to do is to go against your impulse, which was one of the issues he had against like the idea of giving into nature all the time.
Absolutely.
But no one's saying, and it's even the recognition, like if I was born in 1800 in, wherever, Scotland, I'd have a different personality. I'd have different thoughts. I'd have, and, hopefully I would come to the beliefs I have come to. That's where it gets kind of freaky, but I'm not, because God placed me here. So it's not even like always worth speculating, but it's just the idea of like, of course I'd be different with different parents and, a different time frame, a different culture, and all of that. But what does that have to do with the idea that I can't make any decisions on my own, which is what he essentially says when he wants to make one point.
Yeah. Well, and that goes back to the fundamental contradiction of the entire debate and why the debate is ironic. We're debating purpose, and he has a book on purpose. I presume he wrote it on purpose, meaning intentionally, but he just got done saying we don't have intentionality. So if purpose requires intentionality and we don't have intentionality, then we don't have purpose. So why did he write the book?
Yeah.
Why is he doing the debate? Why should anybody listen to him or me or anybody about this stuff? And that's the incredible irony, which is what I bring up in my closing statement, is that I win the debate just by restating Dan's premises, which is we don't have free will, therefore we don't have purpose, because purpose has to be done purposefully.
Yeah.
So that's the problem with the whole thing, which is why I wanted to play the clip, because his whole premise starts from an inherent contradiction.
Yeah.
So let's get a little bit lighter hearted on this one, because we engage in some back and forth, and this is toward the end of the exchange that the moderator has for us before our closing statements. Now, the point of the whole structure was going to be Dan goes first, he gets the first word, but I get the last word. So Dan gets to go first, I would go second, he would go first in the closings, and then I would get the last word. Presumably, I would want to hear Dan's closing, and he would want to hear mine, because we're going to do some Q&A with the audience later, and it may have a point. But that's not what happens. We get switched around, is that I have to go first on the closings. I have to go first because Dan really has to go.
I'm not feeling the Holy Spirit, but I am feeling the bladder right now. I don't know if we can move this along.
Here, Dan. I'm gonna quote your book, Life Driven Purpose. I'll give you just a few minutes here, and then you can do your thing as Abdu gives his closing statements. How's that? And we'll let Abdu go first.
So yeah, I was supposed to go second, but I've never had this happen to me in a dialogue or a debate where my debate partner had to go to the bathroom and then just leave. Now what ends up happening is he responds to something that Sam says, and then he just gets up and leaves. And now I'm going to do my closing, so he doesn't hear almost any of my closing argument, because it's only 6 minutes. Yeah. So I've never had a guy have to do that. So I thought it was just funny to play, because you have to roll with it. You just got to roll with it, and I appreciate it.
in his defense, I have a pregnant wife now.
Oh,
And
boy.
boy, this has changed everything about her biology. So she'd love me bringing this up. But I think I have more compassion now towards people who suddenly have to go relieve the bladder.
Yeah.
So,
Oh, yeah. So I get it.
God bless you, Dan.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
your bladder.
Let's. I'm glad things came out the way they did.
Yeah. What?
Okay. All right. Moving along. All right. So this is Dan's closing. Because I did hear all of Dan's closing, and I think we're going to just pause occasionally here and there to go through it and just make a couple of observations as it goes along.
I got it. Here. Boom. There you go.
You're a good guy. You have a good heart, it looks like. So I appreciate your attitudes here. So tonight's debate is not about does God exist. That's a different debate. I've done a bunch of those. It's not about is Christianity true. It's about whether or not you can have purpose in your life. And of course you can, whether you believe in God or not. And most of Abdul's points hinge.
Paul Abdul.
Yeah, exactly.
We made a joke. He calls you Abdu the whole time. He messed up there, but that's
Yeah.
funny because we used to joke all the time about all the names you get. Abdullah the Butcher, haven't heard that one in a while,
Yep.
so bringing it back.
Yeah.
You know what's interesting? Kong was at an event recently. I think it was at Woodside Bible Church, and someone came up to him and said, "Who's that guy on the show that likes WWE? I like that guy." So I finally got some love.
All right.
For
Good.
the wrestling. Anyway,
You know what? It's about time.
it's about time. Thank you. Okay,
Yeah.
here we are. Dan, my apologies.
On the existence of this God, as if that was a given. It's a belief of his. He doesn't actually know that a God exists. He believes it. And even the Bible says, he who comes to God must believe that he exists. You can't really know it. You have to just believe it. So,
All right. So
I don't know if this is where you wanted to
no,
start.
I want to stop there. That's just misses the point.
Well, it's also being said in the Bible itself, actually, it's being said you must believe to people who were like right there interacting with God in the flesh. Because a lot of the believe language is coming from the New Testament. There's obviously things like trust, but when you're in Israel and you can go and you can experience God in some sense. It's a little bit different. But the believe language comes from the New Testament, and a lot of them are experiencing things. So it's a little even different than just like most Christians would say today. It's quite a bit different than just, I have no proof of anything, and I just want to believe this.
Well, and again, coming from somebody who's preached it for 19 years, Luke preambles his entire gospel, and of course, part 2, which is Acts. We recorded these things so that you may know about the things in which you have believed. And so belief, he wants to make this belief thing be like a epistemological, like weak version of knowledge or certainty. And belief and knowledge go hand in hand. It's this weird dichotomy that he creates between belief and knowing that simply just doesn't exist. Plus, we can believe that he exists, and that certainly isn't a sufficient condition to actually following him. But what is the belief about? You must believe to have relationship with him. I need to believe in my wife, not believe just in her existence, but also in her character, in the fact that she wants a relationship with me. And that's what our marriage actually is believing in each other. And so he's creating a false dichotomy that simply doesn't exist. But I also want to point this out. He says that my arguments presuppose the existence of a God. And later on in his closing, he'll mention that I mentioned some arguments, because in my opening, I do mention some arguments. I mentioned the teleological argument, or the argument from design or fine-tuning. I mentioned the contingency argument. And of course, he doesn't address them. All he does is say, those are bad arguments. That's all he says. And I think the reason he says that is because he starts off his closing by saying, this is not an argument about God's existence. Here's where he misses the entirety of the point, is that I'm not arguing about purpose from Christianity. I'm arguing to Christianity from purpose. He believes we can have purpose. He says it in the beginning of his closing. Of course you can have purpose. You don't need a God to have purpose. You're assuming the existence of God. No, I'm not. You're assuming the existence of purpose absent God. And what I'm arguing is that this purpose we both agree exists in some form or fashion doesn't actually make any sense absent God. That's the argument I was making from my opening, from my closing, and all throughout our interaction together. So he's fundamentally misunderstood the point of the argument.
The reason I stopped believing is because there's no coherent definition of a God. Believers don't even agree with each other about the definition of this God.
So let's pause a second there. This is his closing statement. And he opens his closing by saying this is not about whether or not God exists. And then he goes on and tells us the reasons he doesn't believe in God is because there's no coherent definition of God. By the way, that does nothing to disprove whether a God exists, just because people can't agree on how to define him. We don't agree on how to define energy. Is he really going to argue that energy doesn't exist?
We apparently don't agree on how to define free will either. and he says the atheists disagree with him, and yet he believes we do and don't have it. So.
Yeah. Exactly.
It's the confused response.
Yeah, exactly.
And
this is the kind of thing that happens, if I'm just being honest about it and trying to be deferential. I don't want to be cruel, but when you walk in with 4 blank pieces of paper, your closing is going to be a muddled argument of, we're not arguing about this, we're arguing about this. But I'm going to argue about the other thing we said we're not going to argue about in my closing, which you just said is irrelevant. But that sort of goes to the point, is that just because Christians, and by the way, I think he's fundamentally wrong about this, but just because Christians don't have a coherent, agreed upon definition of God doesn't mean he doesn't exist. And I think Christians have had a coherent, agreed upon definition of God. There might be some nuances in understanding, but the fundamentals are not really up for grabs.
Yeah.
His moral principles or his character or the theology, they're all fighting with each other. There are probably as many Christianities as there are Christians. They all pick a certain point of view. Even though Paul said, let there be no division among you, no disagreement among you, all think of one mind. The Bible says God is not the author of confusion. But can you think of a single book that's caused more confusion than the Bible? It's all over the place.
Well, this is literally irrelevant to the whole debate. It's literally irrelevant. It's not only irrelevant to the debate about purpose, but it's irrelevant to the debate if it were about God's existence.
Yeah, and I'm guessing the point he's going to make is that you I don't know, we'll see. You can't base your purpose off of something that's so confused. Yeah.
There's no good argument for a God. Abdu touched on fine-tuning and contingency, and those are good debates, and those are bad arguments. There is
that's that then.
Yeah, I guess that okay. Well, that proves it.
No really good reply to the problem of evil. I wish we had more time to go into it. Most people today now refer to it as the problem of suffering, and there's no need for a God. Hundreds of millions of people live perfectly good, happy, moral, loving lives, productive, purposeful lives without believing in a God.
This is a thing too that often comes up, and invariably, we're going to see this in the comments and everything. Anytime this comes up is sort of, you'll get atheists saying, I can tell you without a doubt my life has purpose. It's like, yeah, we're not arguing that your life doesn't have purpose. The argument is about, can you properly ground? We think your life has purpose. We're saying from your worldview, you should not believe your life has purpose. Yeah. You don't really have a way to ground that based on your belief system.
Well, and this is a fundamental and repeated misunderstanding of the Christian position. Yeah. This is with regard to the moral argument. Are you telling me that I can't be good without believing in God?
Yeah, same thing.
No, this is one of those, like we had a whole series called Asked and Answered, where these objections keep getting raised, and they keep getting answered, but they keep getting raised.
Yeah.
At least address the argument I'm actually making. So on the moral argument, we're not saying that you can't be good unless God exists. We're saying goodness does not exist unless God exists. So if you're acting good, that's an arbitrary thing you're doing, but it's not actually goodness. And the belief is irrelevant. Whether you believe in God doesn't mean that you can or can't be a good person. Your belief about it isn't important. It's that the thing you believe in doesn't even exist unless God exists. And this is the same thing with purpose, the fact that Dan says we don't have free will because we're deterministic machines, which I think is probably the proper worldview. I don't really have sympathy for the argument from a naturalistic perspective that we actually have free will. I think that if there's no immaterial aspect of our life, then it is right. We're just lights and clockwork.
Yeah.
So if that's the case, then on Dan's view, he feels he has purpose, but he doesn't actually have purpose because purpose itself doesn't exist. That's the argument. So if you're going to make comments in the comment section, please feel free to do so, but please engage with the actual argument. We're not saying you can't feel like you have purpose unless you believe in God. We're saying that you have no purpose, and neither do I, and no one does, because purpose itself is an illusion unless God exists.
Yeah.
Interact with that argument, not the one that is the common misunderstanding of the argument.
Yeah.
You don't actually need it to live a good life. If you feel like you have some existential, metaphysical need to be more than the animal that you actually are, well then of course you're going to torment yourself. Why am I here? Is it all just one big accident? Is that it? Well, yes it is.
Well, okay, pause it there. There it is.
Mm-hmm.
It's all one big accident. That's what it is. So accidents aren't done on purpose. They're done by accident. Mm-hmm. So if your life is an accident, then what rational basis do you have to believe that anything you do is purposeful if everything is an accident and you're no more than the animal that you actually are? We're just animals.
Yeah.
We're just animals acting on instinct.
Yep.
It is one big accident. But accidents can be bad, accidents can be good. Sometimes there are good accidents, and our evolution is one of those. We're not perfect, of course, we're not God. There's a scene in the movie Pee-wee's Big Adventure. I'm not recommending the movie, but...
So I do recommend the movie. This is the biggest problem I had with Dan's presentation the whole time.
Yeah.
Say what you want about God, but keep Pee Wee Herman's name out your... Okay. Here we go.
If he mentioned Dumb and Dumber, then you'd really be upset.
Then I would.
Yeah.
Yeah. This table would be flipped over.
Yeah.
And I'd be fired.
Yeah.
You've probably seen it. Pee-wee's riding his bicycle, and then he crashes and he crumples under the ground, all in a big tangle of heap. And there's these children watching. And Pee-wee looks up and he said, "I meant to do that." As if he could reverse engineer, as if he could go back and say, well, that accident was on purpose. He was trying to instill meaning into an accident where there wasn't. It was just an accident. And our existence is a happy accident.
So, again, this goes back to, I don't need to refute the argument because he's making it for me. He's saying that Pee Wee Herman does something by accident and then later lies and says, I meant to do that, when it clearly is false. Mm-hmm. So he's trying to infuse meaning into an action that has no meaning. So he is engaging in a fiction. Mm-hmm. And this is the part that gets me, is that I would think that an atheistic thinker like Dan Barker, who wrote a lot of books, and anybody who's thinking about this, is after the truth and is unwilling to believe in a lie. And this is the thing that really gets me, is that oftentimes it's the believer in God who is accused of believing in a fiction because that makes them feel good. Mm-hmm. He just got done saying that's exactly what purpose is. It's a fiction you believe in because it makes you feel good. Mm-hmm. I think I would rather believe that the universe did not cause itself and therefore has an outside cause that's personal and wants a relationship with me, because there's a little more rationality than that. So if we're going to believe in things that look like useful fictions, I think I'd rather believe in the thing that has a lot less fiction to it than an admitted fiction. It just seems like an odd thing to be okay with, then accuse a believer of believing the same thing and be mad at him or belittle him or her when they believe in a useful fiction. You believe in one.
Yeah.
I don't believe in a thing that I think is actually fictitious. But if that's okay to believe in a useful fiction because it makes you feel good, then don't be upset with anybody else. And don't write a lot of books about it.
Yeah. And he believes in purpose and free will, but they are currently being stored in the basement of the Alamo. Essentially.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's there.
Yeah.
It's in the basement of the Alamo. Mm-hmm. That's where you'll find it.
Yeah.
You'll have to watch the movie to understand what I'm saying.
Yes, you have to watch. Yeah.
We should be glad. Think about everything that had to happen. We are biological organisms. Why are we here? You know why I'm here? My mom and dad had sex. Your parents had sex. Their parents had sex.
Right.
And they reproduced. And
Enough.
here we are, and generation after generation. When you look at all the birds that are out at the bird
Let's
feeder,
pause
you
a
look
minute
at
there, because this argument, he didn't mean this, and I don't want to imply that he did mean it, because I want to be fair. But he basically says, you're all contingent. In my opening, I talked about the cosmological argument from contingency, is that everything is contingent and doesn't have to be the way it is. That's my entire argument. Things could not have existed. Things could have existed differently, which means they're all contingent. Philosophically speaking, you can't have an infinite set of contingent things. You just can't. So there has to be something that is necessary that doesn't have to be explained by something outside of itself, but explains everything else, because you can't have an infinite set of contingent things. Well, he's basically said life doesn't have to be this way. It's contingent. If that's the case, then I think you necessarily have to have a non-contingent cause to everything as well. So in one sense, it was not intentional, and it's not fully an argument, but it's a bit of a nod to my argument.
Do you ask one of those birds, how did your great-grandparents meet? I mean, you don't really ask, do any of those birds ask themselves, what is my worldview? Why am I? They're just living. They're living and they're enjoying, or whatever they're doing in their lives. And it's the same with us. We are, I can borrow a religious word, we are blessed that we are here. It's just amazing that we exist. It's incredible.
The whole thing is just, so birds don't ask what is their worldview. It's the same with us. We're at a debate. We both spent time asking about purpose. So we do something that animals don't do. And it's not just because our cortexes are more evolved. There is something about the idea of wonder in this whole thing. Yeah. So we're not just mere animals. And if he keeps on reducing us, it's interesting to me, because in the effort to aggrandize human beings as the master of their destiny, he also says we're just like animals who are not the masters of their destinies. They just do stuff based on instinct. So how can we be the rebelling against, the outside enslaving force if we're slaves to causality? It just doesn't, he keeps on saying
Incredible, but it can all be explained naturally. So there's no need, there's no good argument for a God, and this life that we have right now is an accident, but if we want to, we can instill meaning into it, like Pee Wee Herman did. We can say, well, we were meant to exist. We were not meant to exist. It didn't have to happen this way. And just like the birds are churning generation after generation, 100 years ago, all those people were living their lives with purpose and meaning and joy and family and values. My American Indian ancestors, for at least 15,000 years on this planet, on this continent, were living, lives of family and culture and music. And is anyone going to suggest that they didn't know, they didn't have value, they didn't have morality, they didn't have culture, they didn't.
To be clear, no one is suggesting that.
Yeah,
So that's again, this is kind of an emotional,
but
appeal to emotion.
It's an appeal to emotion, and it's also just a personal illustration about the argument that you don't need to believe in God to have culture values. And again, that's not the argument, and it never has been the argument. And also, Native Americans did believe in God.
They believed in a whole bunch of things.
Yeah.
Spirits and ancestors that are still around. So, yeah. Interesting. As Andy Bannister would say. Interesting.
Have beauty before 9,000 years later, when the Israelites said that God gave them the copyright to the Ten Commandments to tell the world how to live. As a human species, we are figuring this thing out. Abdu talked about value. I think he's got it backwards. When we value something, the value increases with rarity. If things are plentiful, the price goes down, right? When things are rare, the price goes up, like a rare postage stamp or something. If there were billions of them, they wouldn't be worth anything. The fact that life is brief, the fact that life is not eternal, the fact that it is rare is what makes it precious. The fact that we're all going to die, all of us are going to die, just like our ancestors. They're all dead and gone, and they're in the grave, and their physical bodies are gone. The fact that we die makes it all the more precious because it is rare, it is special.
Cope. There's a word for that. It's called cope.
Yeah. Well,
He's
did you?
trying.
Yeah.
I don't know if anyone would ever find that actually convincing.
So I've heard this in different places. I actually have heard this. I don't know if it's convincing, but I've heard it in different
I've heard
places.
it from a lot of different.
Yeah.
I think Martin Hagland, Stephen Fry.
Yeah.
It's
And it's. But
Ricky Gervais.
Couple of things on this. One, rare and finite are not the same thing.
Mm-hmm.
He's equated rarity and finitude with the same thing. And the more of it you get, the less valuable it is. So as the population of human beings increase, human beings become less valuable.
Well, and I think so. He's using one example of the market determining the price.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Now, my father was in the Civil War antiques business for many years, and he always said, "You know how much something is worth." And he would say this to sometimes because he would do these consignments where people would say, "I want you to sell this for this amount of money," and they had this grand figure in mind for something that wasn't that great. And he said, "Well, you can look in a book and in a price catalog and whatever and see what something is worth, but it's different when you actually put it for sale somewhere because what it's actually worth is what someone is willing to pay for it. That's the actual. That's how you define the worth, and then that updates those price catalogs, by the way, based on. And I think we have, as Christians, have a pretty good answer if we're going to actually base worth on something like that, what someone's willing to pay for it.
And that's what I said in one of my responses about the problem of evil and suffering, is that you know what something's worth by what you're willing to pay for it. And if the being who grounds all existence is willing to pay a price for you, then you have an infinite value, regardless of how many of you there are. By the way, this argument about life's temporality and its finitude, making it special because there is no afterlife, life is not just growth, existence, and reproduction. He brought up justice almost the entirety of the time, morality and justice, how God is bad and God is unjust and all these. So these very values he speaks of, justice, morality, equality, compassion, all these things, if they die with us, then they don't have any lasting value. Teresa and Hitler got the same exact reward, oblivion. And so the injustices of Hitler and the compassion of Teresa in their lives are the exact same equivalent value, which is a fictitious value. And that goes for the entirety of the human race. It's all grinding down to a heat death. The usable energy, the kinetic, the potential energy in the universe will eventually be used up, and it will be a universe billions of years from now, but it'll be a universe where there is no more molecular movement, and nothing will do anything, and there's no reviving it. Absent God, there's no reviving it. So all the morality, all the justice, all these things, all of it comes to nothing. So it's not valuable because it's rare. Things can be valuable because of their rarity and because of their scarcity, but we're talking about a fundamental qualitative value, not a quantitative value when it comes to human beings. And that's why I used the analogy about what you're willing to pay for something versus this idea of finitude. Plus, like I said, he confuses finitude and scarcity. He confuses those two things. They're not the same concepts, and therefore his argument doesn't actually hold any water.
Yeah.
We should not squander our lives on somebody else's purpose, telling us what we should do. We should choose our own. We should live our own lives. And I would just end echoing what Jefferson said. And Abdu's right. Jefferson was not a Christian. In fact, he cut up the Bible into pieces. And he even told Adams that trying to find some good words of Jesus, and there are some good words of Jesus in the Bible. There are some words that even I admire.
Well, I don't think he admits that in his books.
No, he definitely does not.
I was looking for it. Not that I mean, some of them I didn't quite read every single word, but
Yeah.
But Jefferson told Adams, finding those good words of Jesus is like looking for a diamond in a dunghill. Today they would use it.
But if it's rare, isn't it good?
Yeah. Plus,
shouldn't he love Jesus then? I guess I don't.
Yeah, exactly, because Jesus' good words are so rare.
Yeah.
But it's funny because he quoted Jefferson. I quoted Jefferson earlier about the idea of inalienable rights, and that inalienable rights only exist if God exists, because for a right to be inalienable, it can't be taken away. That's what inalienable means. And if governments have the authority to grant a right, then the government has the authority to remove that right, and that makes them alienable, not inalienable. And so that's why Jefferson says that we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal and endowed by their creator. So he was a deist. So him quoting Jefferson and saying that he couldn't find good words of Jesus, did you notice what he does all the time? He never sticks with the God issue. He wants to go and attack the Bible, and he'll use Jefferson to do it. But Jefferson, to quote Os Guinness, was just a hypocrite.
Yeah.
Because Jefferson was a slave owner.
Yeah.
Jefferson was the kind of guy who would edit the Bible, just like the slave owners who edited the Bibles as well. Now, I'm not saying that Jefferson edited to remove the freedom passages from it, but the reality is that Adams and Jefferson, those two guys, very different people. So that was Dan's closing. We didn't play the whole thing, but that was Dan's closing. You can watch the debate for the whole closing. I just want to respond to a couple of things, but then we get into the Q&A. Now, I want to talk about this a little bit because the format of the Q&A was that the assumption was going to be from the moderator that we would each get asked questions. We could respond to them, sometimes to both, sometimes to one of the other. What ended up happening, and this is why you have a different kind of rule, is that Dan started getting the lion's share of the questions, especially in the beginning, which meant that under the strict rules of the debate, which I think I communicated otherwise, I don't get to respond to. So Dan keeps getting to respond to questions, if they're hard or if they're easy, and say whatever he wants to say, and I have no room to respond. I think I did actually say, hey, if one gets a question and he gets 2 minutes to answer and I get a minute to respond, and then I'd get 2 minutes to answer and Dan would get a minute to respond, so it's reciprocal. That's not how it worked in the beginning. In the beginning, it was Dan got asked, I think, 3 questions in a row, and he got to say whatever he wanted, and he said some things that I needed to respond to because he was doing what he does, which is throw out a bunch of God in the Old Testament or even the New Testament is bad, as opposed to answering the question. So you can kind of look at me and I'm getting a little bit antsy because I'm not able to respond. And then after 3 questions got asked to Dan, Sam said, hey, maybe this is not working out. Why don't you go ahead, Abdu, and respond to them? I had to respond to all of them in like 2 minutes. So I couldn't possibly respond to all of them. So I wanted to play a couple of, not all the Q&A, you can go ahead and see that, a couple of bits of the Q&A to highlight a couple of things. Is one, you got to make sure your rules are clear when you're doing a debate. But 2 is Dan, in a couple of these, kind of responds, but doesn't respond to everything that the questioner asks.
By the way, this is not the odd one.
Is there an odd one that's different than this one? I thought it was because
that's
I'm pretty sure this is it.
Canaanites and
12 is the odd question.
yeah.
Oh.
Go back one more.
How did I miss that?
There we
Oh,
go.
yeah, there it is. Okay, all right.
Immorality is defined as bringing harm to another. Where does the moral ought to not bring harm to another, where is it actually built on? Where does it come from, if not just subjective to your opinion, my opinion, or anyone else's?
Hey, sorry, who's this for, Dan or Abdu? Thank you.
Yeah, that is an excellent question, because why ought we to be, even if we have a basis for a moral philosophy, whether religious or not, why should we, right? And there is no such thing as a moral ought. It's not a thing. Ought is just,
Okay.
it's just one half of a conditional statement. If you wish to have a world with minimal amount of harm and violence, then you ought to act like this. There's no cosmic guarantee that any of us have to, or that it even will. And we can see how a lot of people are not even following that rule. Those of us who call ourselves moral, including Abdu, we consider that since we do want a world with less harm, then we ought to act in this way that minimizes the harm. There are other individuals, though, and we lock them up, right? There are some people who are mentally unhealthy, or who are on, I don't know if it's a bell curve or what, but some people over here who just don't have that feeling of compassion and empathy, and in fact, psychopaths and sociopaths. 4% of the population is psychopathic. They have no empathy or feeling for the pain and sufferings of others, and they exist, and there's a high percentage of them in the jails. So there is no cosmic moral ought. It's only those of us who live in this world who are bumping around with harm and suffering and trying to survive. We consider that since we do wish to live in a world that has less harm in it, comma, then we ought to act in this way. But there's no guarantee that we have to.
Well, that's actually a pretty good response in the sense that he really does admit the case that objective moral values and duties don't exist absent the thing that we want. And since this is what we want, he has...
I was gonna, even ought is maybe the wrong word there.
Right, it is.
You feel you should.
Yeah. Well, even should is sort of wrong
Yeah.
in the sense because each one of those suggests that there is like an obligation to do this thing from an authority that obligates you. But he's not saying that. What he's saying is the second half of a conditional. If you want a world with less violence, it would be efficacious if you did it this way. And then this way, which follows the efficacious, is the moral standard because we want this thing. But if you don't want this thing, then the thing that follows the ought, or in this case, it would be effective for you to do it this way, it would be completely different. So morality is dependent on the result we want, not the thing we are obligated to want. So on his view, we're not obligated to want a world where there's less violence, whether collectively or individually. Just for those of us who want that, we're going to impose the second part of the conditional. We're going to impose that on other people simply because that's the world we want. But there's no moral distinction between what they want and what we want. It's just we happen to have the power to be able to do it. All right, so the next question is a three-part question, where the questioner actually asks him to respond to the idea that God commanded the killing of the Canaanites because of sacrifices they were doing, child sacrifice, we've been talking about this a lot, to Molech. And of course Baal and all this stuff. And one thing that Dan does that's interesting is instead of answering the question, he basically says, no, God's okay with child sacrifice. And the people that were being killed, the Canaanites, were no more morally virtuous than the Hebrews who were killing them. And which isn't really an answer to the question, by the way. It just simply says you're bad too. So here's the clip.
The second question was about killing babies. All of those tribes, the Israelites were no different. The Canaanites were not worse than the Israelites. The Israelites had child sacrifice. Look at the story of Jephthah. Jephthah burned his daughter at the stake to fulfill a vow to God, and then Jephthah was rewarded with a judgeship, which is a position of honor. And Jephthah died after burning his daughter, child sacrifice to the God Yahweh. He was rewarded, he was buried with honors. And so you will find, of course, Abraham didn't go through with it, but it was assumed that you could sacrifice your children.
All right. Wrong. I hate to be like that, but it's just not true. There's a number of things behind the whole Jephthah thing. He has the sequence wrong. Is that Jephthah is awarded a judgeship? By the way, this whole thing is in the Judges, Book of Judges, where everyone did what was right in his own eyes. Right. And there were a ton of stories about the negative consequences of people doing what was right in their own eyes, including sacrificing their children, which was something against the Mosaic law. So Jephthah does it, and it goes badly in that sense because he makes a vow. And the consequences, Jephthah doesn't just do it out of, I think I'll sacrifice. The way Dan said it made it sound like Jephthah sacrificed his daughter in order to get the judgeship. I'm going to appease this angry God, sacrifice a child to get the judgeship. That's not what happened. The context, and you got some more material on this, but the context is that Jephthah says to God, if you give to me my enemies into my hand, I will sacrifice the first thing that comes out of my house. Now, the reality was the first thing that comes out of the door could be an animal, and likely would be an animal because they kept the animals in those particular places. And so Jephthah is not thinking of his daughter. That's not who he's thinking of. That's not the intention. He is thinking of an animal coming out of his house.
He's saying even if it's the most valuable one,
Right. Right. Exactly. He does not have his daughter in mind. It's still foolish for him to do it because it could be, and it ended up being his daughter as well. So this is different, and he's not rewarded for it afterwards. That's just simply a misreading of the story. There's a lot of weeping and lamenting and gnashing of teeth that happens as a result of this, but there's actually more to it than that.
Well, there's a few, because, interpreters and scholars have wrestled with this text. So there's a few things to get through, and I'll try to get through them quickly. But just to point out some things, because and there's essentially three views of what was happening here. Well, and two of them are basically related, but one of them is that he literally did kill her as a sacrifice. That's how it's most often read, and it is mentioned as a burnt offering, which every other mention of that in the Old Testament is a thing that is totally burnt, only ashes left and to God. But the text itself nowhere shows God approving of this. This is something Dan often kind of struggles with, is a narrative description versus a prescription or approval of something. And again, within the context of Judges, you should kind of see what's going on. But he nowhere approves of this, and early interpreters understood this. Josephus later wrote about this sacrifice, saying that it was, quote, neither conformable to the law nor acceptable to God, end quote. One of the reasons why it's sometimes viewed as like, oh, the Bible is okay with this, is because Hebrews 11 puts Jephthah in the hall of faith, essentially. And it's like, well, why that for this vow? But again, no one ever understood it as being because of the vow. It praises other people, including Samson, David, and Gideon, all of whom had major flaws. And so most likely Jephthah was more praised for what he did in battle. And this would agree even with 1 Samuel 12, which does the same thing, which mentions Jephthah along with Jerubbaal, Barak, and Samuel, through whom God, quote, delivered you from the hands of your enemies all around you so that you lived in safety. But the early church was very much aware of this. No early Christian or rabbinic source actually had anything positive to say about Jephthah. Other than, if they're quoting Hebrews 11. But they all understood this was and this is how it was interpreted. They all, as people who were in that context and shared that language and understood what was going on, they all understood that this was not a praiseworthy thing. This is a major, major blunder that he did. And there's other stuff we could go into with that. Why is Paul, if Paul wrote Hebrews, but why is Paul or whoever wrote Hebrews mentioning him there? Is it actually mentioning him, or is it mentioning the story? Because in the early church, and even among early rabbinic sources, you had people praising the daughter of Jephthah a lot. And that would also make sense of why some other people were mentioned here, like let's see, like Barak was a bit of a wimp, and that's why Deborah's raised up. But so it's actually, you could make a case that if you understand how it's working, Deborah is actually the one being praised. Just in this sense, also, Jephthah's daughter is the one being praised, who trusted God in that she wept, but she trusted God and went along with what her father was going to do.
The other thing too is there's another possible interpretation of this.
Well, there's two more, Well, there's possibly more, but the other one is that she was actually just dedicated to lifelong virginity. This is an older view that is not as popular today. But one clue that this is the case in Judges 11 is his daughter asks for 2 months to mourn, not because, she doesn't mention because I'll be dying, but she specifically says because I will never marry. And it focuses on her virginity in the text. And there are evidence. There's evidence of women being in service in the tabernacle in the Old Testament. They were the women who served at the entrance of the tent of meeting. There's even stories from the early church of the early life of Mary, that she was dedicated to the temple and spent her earlier years there until puberty, essentially, that she was kind of a servant at the temple. This would be different than that, but it's still the idea that you could dedicate something to the Lord, and it was for that use. Could only be used by priests or in the temple. So that dedication was that, and sacrifice could have been like that, because sacrifice often involved killing, but the actual term has more to do with gift most of the time,
and consecration and these kind of things.
Yeah, and turning something into food for the gods, that sort of thing. So,
Yeah.
and there's kind of that's a bigger thing to get into, the difference between like how Israel viewed sacrifice, and some pagan nations ended up twisting sacrifice into this bloodthirsty God sort of situation. So that's the other one, that it could be something like a dedication. And the third one is something we've already kind of talked about, is that this is simply just a symbol of how far lost Israel had gotten in the era of the Judges, which is how basically everyone interpreted it. The one about there are some clues that perhaps she was dedicated to the temple, and that may be the case, but most people seem to understand it as, no, this is a sign of how bad things have gotten in the era of the Judges, because there are some things, even like when Josiah finds the book of the law, that's a sign of like something's gone terribly wrong. How do you lose the book of the law?
Yeah.
How do you not even know that there is a book of the law to be lost, that you don't have access to? And so the same thing here. How did Jephthah not know that he wasn't supposed to sacrifice his daughter? And there was a hierarchy of things too. Paul Sloan, in his book on the law recently, has kind of talked about that too, especially the closer you got to the temple, their hierarchy is kind of changing. But there was if you made a rash vow, the proper thing to do would to be accept your guilt for having lied to God, but not go through with the sacrifice. Just go back on your word. That would be better than killing an innocent human being. So how did Jephthah not know that he wasn't supposed to sacrifice his daughter? Especially, that was a major reason for the destruction of the Canaanites, which is all throughout the scripture. And Leviticus 27 starts out talking about how you can make a special vow to dedicate a person to the Lord by giving the equivalent monetary value. So how did he also not know that?
Right.
That even if he had said this will be a sacrifice, he could probably work out with a priest. But assuming they went through with the sacrifice, did the priests not know that either?
Right.
I mean, this is a whole
this is how bad it's gotten.
world of this is how bad it's gotten, and that's so if he had known God's law, he wouldn't have even offered this sacrifice, and he wouldn't have allowed it to go unredeemed. And if he knew God's heart, he wouldn't have gone through with it. So everything the Bible says about human sacrifice, and we can get into that next because that's really important too. But everything the Bible says about human sacrifice, no one would have been confused about the message here.
Right.
And so Dan mentions that Israel did child sacrifice, and I think he's talking about it's affirmed in the Bible. There are cases of Israelites participating in child sacrifice. There is King Ahaz. But here's how it's described. He walked in the way of the kings of Israel. That is not a compliment.
Yeah.
Everyone should understand.
Every
that's,
time.
That's not a compliment.
It's not a compliment.
He even sacrificed his son in the fire, engaging in the detestable practices of the nations the Lord had driven out before the Israelites. So there's one, not a glowing review. Manasseh, he also, quote, did evil in the sight of the Lord, following the detestable practices of the nations the Lord had driven out before the Israelites. He built some altars to the starry host in the temple itself, and he sacrificed his own son in the fire, among other things. So, by the way, this is, again, why did Phinehas spear the two? This is why.
Yeah.
Because
They were doing
he doesn't
this.
want this to happen. Child sacrifice comes up every single time. Psalm 106 talks a lot about this, by the way, and kind of gets into the some of the reasoning behind some of it. It's a whole thing about like what was going on, why it was so bad, the child sacrifice, everything. So Psalm 106 is a good one for people to point out, to go to. But yeah, so Dan might respond here too that, well, especially in the Phinehas case, why did he have to spear them? If that's the problem, then I'd be okay if that's what's going on, just snap his fingers. But I would imagine again, it's sort of, you always make the argument in that moment that you want to, but I would imagine he would still have a problem with something like Ananias and Sapphira, who was kind of a finger snap moment. But anyway,
well, I do have a feeling that this is not a judgment on the man's character. This is just based on no matter what God would have done, it still would have been a problem.
It's a problem. It's kind of it's a lose-lose situation for God typically in these arguments. So just if it needs clarified here, or kind of pulled out in the book of Jeremiah, 3 times we're told from God's own words to Jeremiah that he was never commanded child sacrifice and that it never entered his mind. And he's talking about Canaanites. In Ezekiel, we read 16 verses 20 to 21. God actually says, "You took your sons and daughters whom you bore to me and sacrificed them as food to the idols. Was your prostitution not enough? You slaughtered my children and sacrificed them to idols."
Yeah.
He seems to be against it.
Yeah.
23:37. They sacrificed their children whom they bore to me as food for idols.
Yeah, there's so much of this stuff. I mean, it's just so obvious
Yeah.
that if we're going to start listing scriptures,
Yeah.
well, why don't we list these too?
Yeah.
And say that he's not okay with it. He's simply not okay with it. So that makes the questioner's question such a good question, because the impetus for God commanding the judgment of the Canaanites was because of what they were doing. And what you're pointing out in these scriptures is, and this is why it's not a genocide, because when Israel did the same things, God either judged them directly or he used other nations to judge Israel. And I point that out in the debate too. It's that other nations were used to judge Israel for the same actions that Israel was doing that were detestable in those eyes as well. And so when it comes to Jephthah had to, assuming it was that he sacrificed his own daughter, he had to live with the consequences of not only a rash vow, but also an unbiblical follow-through on that vow, because it's gotten so bad for them all. So I think that, once again, these...
Well, there's a couple more things I want to address just quickly.
Sure.
Because there are places in the law too where, so in the law it's outlawed, in the narratives it's outlawed. There are a couple verses just to mention really quickly. Ezekiel 20 verses 25 to 26. Sometimes people think this is God endorsing it, that for a time he gave his people these bad laws, allowing them to do child sacrifice. But what's actually going on there, because it's clear in the rest of Ezekiel, he's very much against it. He's saying, these are my children. But what's going on in Ezekiel 20 is that it's essentially a Romans 1:24 argument, that he turns people over. He turns the Jews over to, and he does this in other places too. You want to live this way? Fine, I'll let you live this way. And then the horror of how you're living will make you return to me. And that's what happened here. He gave them over to, these are the people, like when you want a king? You got a king. Here's Saul. Good luck.
Yeah.
I'll give you what you want.
Yeah.
There's another instance, Leviticus 27 verses 28 to 29, that Dan has talked about, I believe in his books. And I'll just sort of say really quickly, notice that the word changes when you get to 28 and 29, and it changes to harem.
Okay.
It's not the same word being used for consecrate or vow before. So there's a change, something new going on. And I think the simplest way to look at it, to view it, is because it sounds like he's saying, well, I'll just read it really quickly. So it says, but nothing that a person owns and devotes to the Lord, harem, whether a human being or an animal or family land, may be sold or redeemed. Everything so devoted is most holy to the Lord. No person devoted to destruction, harem, may be ransomed. They are to be put to death. Now, what this is really saying, it uses the word devoted to destruction here. John Walton talks a lot about this word and what it actually means. It means removed from use. Sometimes that can be done violently. Sometimes it's not done violently. All that's being said here is not, there's two things that it could be saying. One, it could be referring to when you go into a land and things are harem. You can't redeem them, or you shouldn't. That's why there's always, don't take anything from that land. That's harem. It's being put to to disuse right now. But some cities that were harem were not all destroyed. So it's clear that destruction is not a synonym with harem. So that needs to be kind of put out there, even though that's often translated that way. But it could just simply be, it's giving the warning that, look, once you devote something to me, you can't then redeem it and take it back. It's mine.
Yeah.
You've devoted it to me. It's been set aside now for this purpose. The only way to get it out of my purpose is for it to be killed. So it's not saying I will do this. It's just because the whole thing, and again, this is where we started off before. It starts off with Leviticus 27 talking about when you make a special vow or dedicate a person to the Lord, you do it by giving that equivalent monetary value. It's not asking for a sacrifice. But when something is harem, it's different and it belongs to him forever. That's the whole thing it's saying. But those are sometimes used as, look, Israel is for human sacrifice.
Yeah.
And that's just not the case when you dig into,
Right.
again, if you read the whole chapter, sometimes it's clear.
Yeah.
Or read the whole book. But in this case, it's even just understanding. Sometimes you have to go behind the English translation because it seems like, if you look at the English translations, it seems like verses 28 and 29 are using the same words, but they change to harem, which is it's a whole other discussion to have on that very interesting word that gets used a lot in warfare context.
And that goes right to the idea of the study of it. And oftentimes the scripture responds to the objections before the objectors even exist, let alone make their objections at all. So I think that the scripture can be clearly understood when it's completely read, and see that these things aren't in favor of this. And so there you have it. Now Dan goes into a discussion. I'm not going to play the clip necessarily, but I do want to talk about this because Dan says that Jesus was in favor of bodily self-mutilation.
Yeah.
And he uses the eunuchs, and he says some were eunuchs from birth, some were made eunuchs, some chose to be eunuchs. This is a hard saying, and let him who has ears to hear understand, kind of a thing. And then elsewhere in one of his books, he says that Jesus was in favor of self-mutilation because he said, if your eye offends you, pluck it out. If your right hand offends you, chop it off. If your foot offends you, chop it off. If he's caused you to sin, it's better for you to enter into hell with one hand, one foot, one eye than it is for you to enter into hell whole. Into heaven with one hand, one eye, than enter into hell whole. And he's saying that Jesus favors bodily mutilation because there's this order of people who took it seriously, like the castrati and all this. And in one of his books, I think he says Oregon. Is it Oregon or Origin?
Origin.
Origin. It's a soft G.
Yeah. The Origin Trail.
Yeah, the Origin Trail. So that Origin actually did this, and people followed this procedure, when in fact it was incredibly rare, and most people understood this to be figurative. Both that he's trying to point out, and I point out the figurative nature of with the eunuchs. He's not saying you should become a eunuch by doing something physical to your body, but there's more of a spiritual orientation towards the Lord, where you dedicate yourself in this way, as opposed to actually doing something to yourself that makes you into a eunuch biologically. But I just found it crazy that a plain reading of that passage, where about the eye and the foot and the hand, is he's not saying I want you to actually cut your hand and your foot and your eye out, especially given how tough it is to get along in the ancient agrarian society of the ancient Near East. It's clearly and obviously a metaphor for something that he's trying to convey. And so for him to say in his books, he didn't say it in the debate, but in his books, that particular instance, it's evidence of the fact that we're willing to take something someone says in the worst possible light it could possibly be taken in, and then interpret it in that way, and then use it as an evidence against it. It's the epitome of straw manning.
Yeah, and just even to look at it kind of factually, also this issue of castration that he talks about. One thing it's not this widely commonplace thing that's going on, and I think he would agree that just because some Darwinists ended up being social Darwinists who were in favor of something like, say, the final solution to get rid of this one race they considered an inferior race. I would think he would say that is not an indictment on Charles Darwin.
Right.
I would think.
Yeah.
Because one, it's so rare, but even if it wasn't rare, if it was a ton of people believe that, is that actually what Darwin meant for them to believe?
Right.
Possibly not. I would say probably not.
Yeah.
So, so he sees, again, I think he would admit that in other cases, but in this case he thinks that. And so I just even want to factually, one, the origin thing, probably most likely a myth created to discredit him, and actually maybe to align him with Arians, because there was one early case, significant case, that was an Arian bishop that did this. But this, again, he's not within the church at the time. He's an Arian. He's a heretic. He's, he's sort of, you can't say, oh yeah, this is, the vast majority of people understood it correctly. And John Baer's book on origin goes into this, but the vast majority of people understood this. All the ancient interpreters understood this. They understood the idioms that Jesus was using, the way people would talk in hyperbole to get a point across. And there is, and even then, there were clearly a lot of eunuchs around. What's rare is people becoming eunuchs because of these verses of the Bible. There could have been a significant number of eunuchs around, because apparently barbarians did this to people. You would do this to enter into the. Sometimes parents would do it to their children because they wanted them to be government officials, and this was a way you could do. Some roles could only be filled by eunuchs, because then you weren't viewed as a rival for the throne.
Right.
And so we're only going to let you this close if you do that. There was a kind of from 1700s and into the 19th century, there was a Russian sect of Christians that they said they were Christians that did that. They were considered schismatics by the Russian Orthodox Church. So again, they weren't really. This is clearly fringe people doing fringe things.
Right.
And then the castrati themselves, I looked up and tried to find. I was reading some of the scholars you can get access to for free, which is a problem. But there's no sign that there was any religious reasons for why they did that, because it was typically done before puberty for the sake of their singing voices.
Right.
And so that means their parents were making that decision. And it could also be for their future prospects in places of power and whatever. But it just also happened to help them with their singing voices. It kept them high, especially in places where women couldn't sing for whatever reason, if that was some rule there.
And that's significant because you said about the castrati order. He mentions the castrati order as if it was a result of what Jesus said.
Right.
And it's got literally nothing to do with it.
Nothing. It was already going on, and typically they were often in church choirs in the Byzantine world and in the Latin world. And there were maybe times. There's not. It was always officially outlawed to do this. This is one of the big documents, one of the big councils that all Orthodox churches, lower O Orthodox churches everywhere agree with. The Council of Nicaea, the first canon, is against castrating yourself willfully. Said if it happened for a medical reason, if it happened because of barbarians, whatever, then you can still be in the clergy. If you chose to do it, then you're disqualified from being in the clergy. Yeah. And these were the Christian leaders getting together to decide on things about the Trinity and or not decide, but to formulate and to clarify. So so it was clear that there was always church teaching against this, and that they were just accepting men who at a young age had this happen to them for whatever reason, and they were allowing them to come into the church choir. Yeah. Did they sometimes slip into, in some sense, maybe passively endorsing it? Possibly, but we're not here to defend everything that ever happened in church history. We're here to question, did people get this idea from the Bible? And it seems like for the most part, the vast majority of the castrati are not doing this for anything. It was cultural. It wasn't biblical.
Yeah. So moving on from that, well,
leave that little image in your mind.
So I'm going to play a clip here where Dan, during the Q&A, is asked about how does he define nature, and asks about what is nature's source. And the reason I want to talk about this is not necessarily to debunk his response to what is nature and what is nature's source, because I think it's almost, anyway, I'll leave it as it is. But he makes a comment about God's greatness that I wanted to respond to. So here's the whole clip.
What is the source of the natural world?
Well, why ask if there's a source? If there's a God, what is the source of God? Is God sitting up there wondering, how did I get here? Why am I here? What is the purpose of my life? I just find myself sitting up here and I'm, God can't even be great in that sense because there'd be nothing to compare with. The greatness would not make any sense to some being like that. So if God doesn't have to ask for what is my source, we don't have to ask. I mean, we can go back to the Big Bang. We can look at a lot of those things, but why even ask that question unless you have a theistic agenda in mind in asking that question in the first place?
All right, Abdu, I do want to move on just because we have
Okay.
20 minutes here. Thank you.
So I didn't have a chance to respond, obviously, as the clip said. But a couple of things is that when he says, what is the source of God and all this, this is a very common, we actually had a response to this in one of our Asked and Answered series about a fundamental misunderstanding of God as being a being among other beings, as opposed to being the source of all other things existing. So this goes back to, and I anticipated he would say this, which is why it was in not only my opening, but also in my closing. And he didn't actually address it. He said it's a bad argument, the argument from contingency. But he just basically said he doesn't have a response to it because he says, what about God? God is a necessary being. And he didn't engage with that at all. And so he says that greatness wouldn't even make sense to a being who just exists necessarily because there would be nothing to compare it to. That is what makes him great, is that when all other things come into existence, he is the only thing that doesn't, which makes him great. That's a great making property. You depend on nothing and need nothing for the source of your existence. So greatness from our perspective is based on comparison. Greatness from his perspective is based on ontology. He doesn't need anything to exist for him to exist, and that makes him great compared to all the things that are potentially going to exist in the future and are contingently going to exist. Right. So he misses the entirety of the point here as well. So I didn't have a chance to respond to it there, but I do have a chance to respond to it now.
Isn't that part of there? That is part of the comparison, though. I mean, you could compare it to, because I think most people think, well, I can't do that, so that's a comparison.
Yeah.
Something or someone created all of this, and if I try to draw a picture, it looks nothing like anything. It's terrible. My handwriting is bad. Anything I try to create is flawed in some way, and he creates this perfect cosmos that we kind of smudge a little, but or maybe a lot. But there's even so I don't even know what he means by there's nothing to compare it to.
Well, he's using greatness as a superlative. Is that greatness is dependent upon the comparison with something else. So something is greater than something else in virtue of its comparison to that thing. And so I think, if I'm being as charitable as I can to his statement, what he's trying to say is that if there existed a state of affairs where the only thing that existed was God, then at the moment when God could not be compared to something else, he could not be great because the concept is incoherent. In virtue of no comparables. But that very fact is already the thing that makes him ontologically great. Right. Not great like, man, that's great, but great in the sense that his very nature is self-existent. And as we think of a concept of self-existence, that is, to us, because we don't self-exist, is unfathomable in one sense, but to him it's totally fathomable. But that doesn't mean that it's qualitatively unimpressive. It's clearly amazing that he self-exists, and even not only that he self-exists, but that he can make choices, and that by making those choices, he can cause everything else to exist as well. He could just be a necessary being that is effete. He has no properties whatsoever, like the number 7.
Right.
But he is beyond self-existent. And so in one sense, it's like that argument, It's not really an argument. It's just a statement. But it doesn't really hold water in that sense either.
Yeah. It works a little better when he tries it with his reaction to the Kalam cosmological argument. And I'm wondering if he's trying to smuggle in a little bit of that reasoning.
Oh, maybe.
Here.
Yeah.
Because he has that his argument essentially, and he didn't get into it, but he does argue about it in some of his other books. Is that, well, if you're saying, the whole like everything that begins to exist has a cause, that's basically just a synonym for God. If you don't have something else in that that set of things that would also be there, if you can't even, it doesn't even have to be real, but could you imagine something other than God that would also begin to exist?
Yeah, he's basically saying it's question begging.
Yeah.
The Kalam is question begging because everything that begins to exist has a cause. The universe begins to exist, therefore the universe has a cause. And he's saying, well, if you put God outside of the things that begin to exist, that's question begging because you're assuming that God is a kind of thing. But it's not question begging because the whole idea is, first of all, the Kalam doesn't say it has to be a certain kind. It's a first step towards something, that everything that begins to exist has a cause. The thing that doesn't begin to exist, because there's got to be something that doesn't begin to exist, doesn't have a cause. That's the whole point of it.
Right. And that's what I meant with the synonym. I misstated that a little bit.
But yeah, he says it's question begging. So I think he's trying to smuggle that in here, but it doesn't work. Yeah. I don't think it works, at least from my perspective. So anyway, that's the clips I had. There's a lot more we could have reacted to, a ton. I think I reacted to them well enough during the course of the debate. And the good news was is that after the debate was over, there was a lot of people who wanted to talk with me. I didn't see how many wanted to talk with Dan, but a lot of people, including people who weren't Christians, who spent some time talking with us and going over some of these issues. We stayed very late into the night, even though we were kicked out of the main auditorium area that we were doing the debate in. We were in the hallways, and then we talked to people afterwards. And some really good, engaging, thoughtful discussions. Now, what I hope during the course of this whole thing is that, I responded to the debates. I'm responding to the arguments a little bit to Dan himself as a man, not because I think he's a bad guy or anything like that. It's just he's used these arguments again and again and again. And those who find them persuasive, what I hope is that people understand, I think Dan has infinite value as a human being. And I enjoyed talking to Dan. He took not so subtle pot shots at not only the God of the Bible, but my relationship with God in that sense was considered to be a delusion. And hopefully I responded during the debate compassionately, but also with the firmness that was required. And hopefully during our conversations here, we can sort of...
we had fun, but we
have
no
some fun
ill will.
No, not at all.
And I think he's a good faith debater. He believes what he's saying.
Yeah, I do believe that. And I think that if he were to even watch this response, that he might say, I get it, and all that, and he would probably have the same kind of attitude as well. But ultimately, we want the best for Dan. We want the best for everybody who whether they believe in God like us or different than us, or don't believe, we want ultimately them to have that relationship with God. And I believe ultimately that is our purpose. Our purpose is not obey and be dictated to. It is relationship with the source of all being. And yes, obedience is part of that because he is the greatest possible being. But ultimately, what we want is relationship. We want everybody else to have that as well. That's the point of the debate. It's not just to have the academic debate about whether purpose is an illusion or real. It's about whether or not you can have the effectuation of a purpose, which is relationship with the source of all of creation. I can't think of a better purpose than that.
Yeah. Amen.
All right.
You can have it.
Yeah.
It's easy.
Yeah, not hard. All right. Well, thanks, Derek. It was just fun.
Yeah.
Yeah. All right. I have no closing argument except to say that the defense rests.